Greetings, traveler through time. Let the weight of the day drift away, for here on the quiet edge of the 9th century, the air thickens with the promise of rest. In the small forgotten village of Montfaucon, under the rule of Lord Arnaud, night falls slowly, wrapping the straw and clay huts in a velvet grey calm. I'm merely an old historian, ready to whisper stories long forgotten. If sleep comes to you, I'll be glad. But tell me, from what corner of the world have you found your way to me? The scent of peat smoke, mingled with baked rye bread and damp earth, lingers like a silent prayer over the freshly harvested fields. A cool breeze brushes the skin, a soft kiss from the open plain, announcing the coming of night, a time when the earth's secrets seem to murmur louder than any human voice. Thomas, a young man whose simple name belied the restless curiosity of his 20 years, sat on the step of his cottage, feeling the last warmth of the day fade from the rough wood beneath his calloused hands. His eyes followed the dark horizon, where the Lord's castle rose like a heavy shadow, and in that silence, the injustice of the world felt almost solid. He had spent the past days trying to decipher his grandfather's fragmented notes, a worn parchment that spoke of a time when his family's name, once less common, had ties to a noble line long vanished. Those lines told of how that lineage had been erased under the crushing weight of forged debts and taxes. From far away, the abbey bells marked each passing hour, giving rhythm to life in Montfaucon. And for Thomas, each toll was a reminder of time lost, of truths buried under custom. Inside, a flickering candle cast trembling shadows on the wall. He could still feel the parchment's brittle texture between his fingers, a piece of evidence that seemed to pulse with the echo of an unresolved past. The story it told was one of slow and deliberate dispossession, a medieval legal process that seemed fair but hid deceit and corruption. For peasants, or serfs, life in a fief meant almost total obligation. Beyond the unpaid labor owed to their lord each week, they had to give a share of their harvest and pay to use the mill or the oven, usually in crops or labor. Under such a system, saving money or paying off debt was nearly impossible. Thomas pressed the parchment to his chest, breathing in its faint smell of old mold and soil. Most serfs around him accepted their fate, believing the feudal order was the divine will of God and king, an idea strengthened by the church. But his grandfather's story told him otherwise, that serfdom wasn't destiny, but a man-made trap, built slowly over generations. That truth sat in him like a cold stone, heavier than the chill creeping through the door. Only the frogs in the swamp and the wind through the cracks broke the stillness. The night's peace hid the storm rising inside him. He knew confronting Lord Arnaud with such a fragile document bordered on madness, for a serf's word against a noble's could cost his freedom or worse. Yet his anger kept him warm. Above him, the sky stretched wide and pure, the Milky Way a silver river in the dark. The vastness of it made his servitude feel small, and his thirst for justice immense. He thought of his mother, who had woven her life away in silence, and of his father, who had died under the weight of endless labor. Both had believed submission was inherited like blood, but the parchment spoke of a right, of land that had once belonged to them, stolen through the fine print of false contracts. The feel of the soil beneath his bare feet stirred both love and loathing. He knew its texture, its scent, its moods, but it would never belong to him. Feudalism, a system where land meant power, kept peasants bound to the fields, not slaves, but not free either. Many such bonds had begun as promises of protection. Small landowners gave up their plots to stronger lords in exchange for safety. But protection, over time, turned to bondage. That thought lit a quiet fire inside Thomas. He couldn't accept submission any longer. The memory of his ancestors demanded more than silence. He could almost smell the incense and wax of the original seals, though the parchment he held was only a copy. The hum of night insects droned like a steady chant, and he decided his own persistence would match theirs. He knew the castle wasn't just stone and towers, it was the shape of the power that had silenced his family. The calm of the fields clashed with the violence of what the parchment revealed, but the cold outside wasn't as strong as the heat burning in his chest. He rose, tucked the document away, and stepped forward, the first step toward truth, guided by the pale light of the moon. He drew a deep breath. The scent of dew settling on the grass filled him with calm. Nature, he thought, kept no contracts, forged no debts. Life in Montfaucon might move in its rhythm of sowing and harvest, sun and rain, but his life now followed another rhythm, the rhythm of search and awakening. He thought of Eustache, the old abbey scribe, the only one who could read the truth in such an ancient text, and felt a surge of urgency. The scholar might be his only hope to give the parchment its voice. The night, with its stars and silence, seemed an ally. The distant trees stood like witnesses to his awakening. The dry edge of the parchment brushed his fingers, a ghostly touch, and he shivered at the thought. What was nobility but a word written on paper? And what was servitude, if not the same? He stepped back inside, leaving the darkness outside but carrying a spark of light within. The fire's soft crackle filled the room, the smell of smoke curling around him. He lay down on his straw bed, its roughness pressed against his back, but this time it didn't bother him. It felt like the ground beneath a beginning. His curiosity had grown beyond his own name. How many others in Montfaucon had been cheated the same way? How many injustices lay hidden beneath the noble words of tradition? The image of the castle changed in his mind, from a symbol of divine order to one of manipulation. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. The scent of smoke, the rasp of straw, the quiet, they all built an air of expectation. He understood now that the Lord's true power wasn't in soldiers or walls, but in memory's fragility and the peasant's ignorance of the law. Thomas rested a hand over his chest, where the parchment lay. His mission wasn't just to reclaim land, it was to reclaim remembrance. In medieval law, a serf wasn't a slave. He couldn't be sold apart from the land and had a few basic rights. But those rights were thin, and his servitude was inherited. He owed banalities, fees for the Lord's mill, press and oven, keeping him forever dependent. That was what Thomas wanted to understand. The parchment was the key. Through the small window, a breeze carried the murmur of a nearby stream, a whisper of water over stone. It reminded him how time, too, flowed endlessly. He imagined his ancestors watching their freedom fade, year after year, until bondage became law. He breathed slowly, in, out, trying to calm the pounding in his chest. History, he realized, wasn't written only in great books. It lived in people like him. The cruelty of feudalism was that it disguised theft as order, injustice as divine will. He pictured Lord Arnault's cold face and felt fear, but beneath that fear, a heavier weight, duty. This wasn't just about freedom. It was about truth, dignity, and memory. The night deepened. The crickets sang louder. Montfaucon's darkness wrapped around him like a cloak. And in that silence, Thomas knew truth like dawn could be delayed, but never stopped. Sleep came at last, soft and slow like mist over the fields. He surrendered to it with one final thought, that dawn would bring not only labor, but revelation. The candle had gone out, yet its warmth lingered behind his closed eyes, the quiet shape of hope itself. Thomas's sleep was light, filled with drifting visions of fluttering parchments and distant voices speaking in the language of laws and land. When he awoke, the cold morning air slipped into the hut, carrying with it the damp scent of hay and manure, the inevitable aromas of rural life. He dressed quickly in his coarse wool garments, the only shield against the chill before sunrise, and the rough fabric against his skin was a constant reminder of his place in the world and the long hours of labor ahead. He knew the corvée, the Lord's compulsory labor, awaited him, but this day's journey held a secret purpose that made the monotony of fieldwork almost bearable. His first and most crucial step would be to reach the Abbey of Saint-Grégoire, a few hours' walk away, to seek the guidance of Brother Eustache, an aging recluse with deep knowledge of both secular and ecclesiastical law, wisdom that could give weight to his discovery. When he stepped outside, Montfaucon was awakening. The sound of hens scratching the dirt and the creak of wooden carts under their load replaced the silence of night. He passed other serfs trudging toward the fields, their faces marked by weariness and resignation even before the day had begun. Thomas exchanged brief greetings, but kept the parchment secret close to his chest. He knew suspicion and fear were the true currency of his time. Concealing the truth of oppression was one of the system's most effective ways to endure, and he carried a burden far heavier than his hoe, a truth that could shake the foundations of the fief itself. As he walked, the sun began to rise, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. The light's warmth against his face was comforting, a gentle contrast to the chill of his mission. He recalled one of his grandfather's short tales of a time of famine so severe that peasants had eaten acorns to survive, while the lord in his castle feasted on meats and spices from the east. That story of abundance and hunger had always stayed with him, a sharp symbol of feudal injustice where the same soil birthed lives so unequal. The fields before him glistened with dew, breathtakingly green, yet for Thomas, that beauty was tainted by the knowledge of stolen rights buried beneath it. He reached the Lord's domain, where dozens of serfs already toiled, their motions mechanical, synchronized with the rhythm of harvest. Thomas took up his hoe and joined them, though his mind was elsewhere, wandering through the imagined archives of the abbey. He pondered how the feudal system went beyond economics. It shaped thought itself. Serfs were raised not to question, to see their lord as both ruler and father, and the very idea of noble descent seemed heretical. The work was grueling, but Thomas focused on the smell of the freshly turned soil, the steady sound of his tools striking earth, using the rhythm of labor as camouflage for his restless thoughts. He rested beneath a great oak that had shaded generations before him. Hidden under his clothes, he touched the parchment once more, creased, slightly damp from sweat. The brief pause offered a moment of stillness before the next step of his plan. It's worth noting that a medieval peasant's diet was meager and repetitive, mostly rye bread, oatmeal, beans and peas, with meat reserved for feast days, or stolen through poaching. This lack of nourishment weakened their bodies and made their exhaustion part of the system itself. The contrast between such poverty and the Lord's extravagant banquets echoed the injustice the parchment revealed. Looking toward Lord Arnault's castle, now bathed in the pale gold of morning, Thomas realized that the fortress was built not only of stone, but of paper, of laws, and of selective memory. Its towers and battlements were designed to intimidate, but beneath that strength lay the fragility of a power founded on deceit. He needed a reason to leave before noon. The best excuse was a family emergency near the abbey, his aunt's supposed illness. He approached the overseer, a stern man of few words, and with trembling but steady voice, explained his urgent need. The man hesitated, but Thomas's anxious expression did the rest. The small act of deception, though harmless, drained him. It required a constant strain of emotion, far heavier than manual labor. Once dismissed, Thomas began his journey towards Saint-Grégoire. The landscape shifted from open fields to a dense, shadowy forest. The scent of pine and wet moss filled the air, and the crunch of dry leaves under his boots became the only sound, his hurried steps matching the rhythm of his racing heart. Invisibility was his shield. No one would suspect a peasant's son of carrying a secret capable of shaking a noble's throne. Arriving at the abbey, the air changed. High walls enclosed the compound, and from within came the solemn echo of Gregorian chant, a deep, steady sound that filled the soul with peace. The scent of beeswax and old parchment was strong, thick with history. Thomas felt that he had crossed from the world of submission into the realm of knowledge. He found Brother Eustache bent over a desk in a small scriptorium, copying sacred text by the faint light of a high window. When Thomas gently touched his shoulder, it was with reverence. The old monk, with his white beard and ink-stained hands, looked up, a living beacon of wisdom in an age of silence. Listening to Thomas's tale, he took the parchment carefully, his thin fingers tracing the faded letters as if feeling the truth through touch. Then came a silence so dense that Thomas could hear his own pulse echoing in his ears. When Eustache finally spoke, his voice was calm and deliberate. He explained that the document described a forged emphyteusis, a long-term lease that disguised the forced alienation of land, often hidden behind manipulated census records or debts. His eyes, bright with weary understanding, met Thomas's. The young man's suspicion was right. What his family had lost a century ago was not through divine will or honest debt, but through calculated fraud, sealed under law. The monk confirmed the parchment's authenticity, his tone low and grave. Thomas's family had been trapped by legal deceit generations ago. Their servitude was born not of fate, but of theft. Relief flooded Thomas, but so did dread. Truth, he realized, was more dangerous than ignorance. Eustache, guided by faith and conscience, warned him to act with utmost caution. Still, he offered to make a careful copy of the document should the original ever be lost or destroyed. Thomas left the abbey carrying a new kind of weight. The parchment that had once been a faint hope was now undeniable proof. The wind through the forest no longer whispered emptiness. It carried truth through the valley of Montfaucon. The image that stayed with him was that of fresh ink drying on parchment, its scent sharp and potent, the aroma of justice newly written, calling him to face the darkness of power with the fragile light of truth. The weight of the parchment, now duplicated and authenticated, seemed to burn in Thomas's hands as he made his way back to Montfaucon. The afternoon breeze blew colder, carrying the sharp scent of oncoming rain, and the rustle of leaves beneath his boots was the only sound breaking the forest's silence. The chill of the metal hoe he carried reminded him of the labor still awaiting him, yet the warmth of truth inside him kept the cold at bay. The abbey, with its stone walls, had been a safe womb for his secret, but now that secret had been born into danger. His next task was clear: to discover whether his family's deception had been an isolated case or part of a wider practice buried beneath the natural order of Lord Arnaud's domain. When he reached the village, the sky was thick with dark clouds, and the heavy air promised a stormy night. Thomas sought out Jacques, an older and well-respected serf known for his sharp memory and quiet skepticism toward the Lord's authority. He found him in the forge, helping to shape a new iron piece. The strong smell of burning coal and molten metal filled the space, while the rhythmic clang of the hammer against the anvil seemed to mark time itself. The heat from the fire burned Thomas's face, a reflection of the urgency burning inside him. Cautiously, amid the roar of the forge, Thomas began to steer the conversation. He didn't reveal his secret yet. Instead, he asked Jacques about the old stories of Montfaucon, how families had first fallen into servitude. Jacques paused, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and looked at Thomas with eyes far keener than his worn face suggested. He spoke of the old peasants, once allodials, free owners of their land, who, after years of poor harvests, crushing taxes, and constant fear of raids, had gradually surrendered their property to the Lord. In return, they received protection and food security, much like what had happened after the fall of the Roman Empire when feudal bonds began to form. The old man's recollection carried a striking historical truth. Between the 9th and 11th centuries, the number of small freeholders declined sharply. Many couldn't afford the costs of warfare or the chaos of the age. They entered into commendation contracts, a pledge of loyalty that transferred ownership of their lands to a noble in exchange for protection, allowing them to remain as tenants but stripping them of sovereignty. What Jacques suspected, and what Thomas was now close to proving, was that many lords had hastened this decline through deceit, manipulating weights and measures during tax collection or refusing to renegotiate debts during famines. Jacques mentioned the Dubois family, whose land had been seized 2 generations earlier under the claim of unpaid grain debt, even after a year of good harvest. Their story echoed Thomas's, only theirs had vanished into rumor, lacking proof. Thomas ran his fingers along the rough wooden handle of Jacques' hammer, realizing that the very tools of their trade were also the symbols of their bondage. The steady rhythm of the hammer now sounded not like labor, but like awakening. With a smoky sigh, Jacques spoke of the quiet mystery haunting the village, how so many sensed, deep down, that something was wrong. They knew their family's servitude hadn't begun fairly, but without written proof, and with fear as their keeper, they stayed silent. The law and its enforcers always sided with the Lord, and the smallest act of defiance was met with punishment. For a serf, the absence of freedom wasn't just physical, it was legal and psychological. Encouraged by Jacques' openness, Thomas carefully withdrew the folded parchment from inside his tunic. The faint heat of it seemed to burn through the fabric. He revealed it to the older man, explaining what Brother Eustache had confirmed. The dim light of the forge flickered over the yellowed surface, and Jacques' eyes widened as he took in the sight. That fragile document wasn't just proof of Thomas's lineage. It was the embodiment of every silenced suspicion the villagers had carried for generations. Emotion washed over Jacques' face, a mix of fear and long-buried hope. He understood now that the feudal order, so rigid and eternal in appearance, was built on a web of deceit and forged papers. The bond between lord and serf had not been divine, it had been written. Indeed, in medieval Europe, the written word itself was power. Literacy and record-keeping were privileges of the clergy and nobility, while the peasants' illiteracy made the manipulation of land charters and contracts almost effortless for those who controlled ink and law. The revelation sparked an even deeper question for Thomas: how many others had been robbed by the same hidden fraud? He and Jacques began listing quietly and methodically the oldest families of Montfaucon, tracing the echoes of loss through time. The scent of metal and smoke thickened in the air, and the steady hammering gave way to a silence heavier than the storm clouds above. The night was closing in on Montfaucon, but for the first time the truth was beginning to open. Dawn crept over Montfaucon like breath on cold glass, faint and tender, softening the edges of rooftops rimed with frost. Thomas stood at the threshold of his cabin, feeling wood bite his palm with a clean, dry rasp. The parchment rested against his ribs, warm from his body, cool at its edges where night still lingered. Smoke of peat and pinched embers threaded the air, sweet and earthy like bread remembered. He breathed slowly, letting the stillness teach him patience instead of fear. Across the field, the forge's first cough rose, iron clearing its throat before speech. Thomas listened for that rhythm, hammer, hiss, breath, as if truth itself kept time there. His boots worried dew-dark soil. Cold climbed his ankles and steadied his thoughts. Somewhere a rooster tested the morning, too early and yet right on cue. He touched the folded seal, feeling confidence like a candle cupped from wind. He pictured Brother Eustace's steady hand, ink lifting a line into being, law coaxed from shadow. The monk's warning still vibrated, caution, not retreat, prudence, not delay. Justice, Thomas knew now, had a cost measured in nights without sleep. But the village's silence would no longer be the silence of resignation, it would be the silence of work, careful, watchful, joined. At the brook, mist lay low like a sleeping animal, fur of water beading on reeds. The chill licked his cheeks. He cupped the cold, then tasted iron on his tongue. Some truths arrived like that, metallic, bracing, impossible to mistake. The parchment did not change the air, it changed the way he breathed it. He turned toward the lane, where hoofprints held last night's news in soft mud. Jacques met him near the fence line, coat steaming faintly where frost met forge heat. The older man's eyes carried ember light. Tired, yes, but awake in a new way. They spoke with their shoulders first, a nod that said not safe, but ready. Thomas unbuttoned only enough to show the doubled fold, then hid it again. "Today we listen wider," he said, "and write straighter than they ever expected." They began with small things, the weights at the mill, the measure at the press. A handful short here, a ladle shy there, quiet arithmetic of theft. Wind slid through barley stubble, thin as a blade, bright as a bell. Each complaint was a spark. Together they hinted at a seam of fire. Jacques kept count aloud, so memory would hear itself and hold. At midday the village smelled of straw singed in kitchens and onions sweetening in fat. Children chased a rag ball, laughter skipping in uneven stitches. Thomas stood apart just long enough to remember what he fought for. Ordinary hours. The parchment pressed his heart like a vow, reminding and restraining. He moved on, keeping his voice level, his questions humble and exact. Dame Ilara opened her door before he knocked, as if the air had warned her. She smelled of dried thyme and smoke, hands stained green by the mercy of plants. Her story did not flare. It thickened, slow as syrup. Fees for the Lord's oven, a levy for repair, then interest, then arrears, until bread meant bondage. She spoke gently, but every word fit another in Thomas's growing ledger. He asked to see the oldest basket she still mended, the one from her husband's father. Willow ribs shone with the polish of years, a curve remembering grip and need. "Things keep witness," Ilara murmured, tapping hinge and weave. Thomas nodded, feeling the truth of wood, honest, patient, unforgiving of lies. He promised to return, and did not promise safety, only company. By afternoon, clouds had lowered like heavy curtains, light bruised to pewter. Wind combed the rye in backward strokes, leaving cowlicks of silver. Thomas's breath smoked with effort. His knuckles reddened where the cold spoke hard. Still, the work felt different now, fatigue salted with purpose rather than fear. Jacques walked beside him, counting softly, as if praying over numbers. At Remy's, the room tasted of damp straw and boiled turnip, plain as a prayer. The former soldier's cough clipped his sentences, but not his resolve. He told of levies dressed as duties, of horses borrowed and never returned. "Sword first, then pen," Remy said, tapping his temple. This cut deeper. Thomas wrote the phrase in his head, where ink could not yet be seized. They ended the circuit at dusk, where geese complained at the mill race, white against ash. The miller avoided their eyes, wiping his palms more than the flour demanded. Jacques weighed the day with a blacksmith's precision. Blow, quench, inspect, repeat. Thomas felt the village's heartbeat, still cautious, now coordinated. Stormlight flickered far off, a warning and an omen both. Night settled like wool over shoulders, prickly, familiar, oddly kind. Thomas lit a stub of tallow and watched the flame decide its shape. The cabin breathed with him, reed mat rasp, hearth pop, door slat sigh. He unfolded the parchment on the table and touched each letter like a name. Justice was not fast, he thought, but it was faithful. He sharpened the goose quill by habit, though he had no ink to spare. The blade's whisper against feather calmed him better than psalms. Outside, frost wrote its own law on the window, minute and exacting. He traced it with a fingertip until cold argued him back to sense. Then he wrapped the quill in linen, a soldier sheathing a slim blade. Sleep came in shallow cups, refilled by the dark each time it spilled. He dreamed parchment fluttering like startled birds, seals clacking like teeth. Eustatia's voice braided with Ilara's and Remy's, chant over drumbeat. When he woke, the hearth smelled of last night's courage grown cool. Courage rekindles, he told himself, the way coals do, if guarded. Morning stepped in crisp and candid, blue as hammered tin. Thomas chewed rye crust hard as memory and sweeter than pride. He counted the names again, whispering them into warmth. Each was a bead. Together they were a rosary of debt and dignity. He tucked prayer and paper into the same pocket and set out. At the commons, fog clung ankle-high, sheep drifting like low clouds. A bell far off tolled one, then thought better, and tolled again. Jacques met him with a slate he'd chalked at first light. Numbers frosted the surface, tallies of grain, days, dues denied. Thomas smiled, quiet triumph at this new habit of proof. They tried an experiment, weighed the mill's measure against Ilara's jar. Difference, a thumb's breadth short, just enough to hide in a busy day. The miller protested custom. Jacques answered with arithmetic. Custom wilted, as custom will, under clean sun. Thomas recorded nothing aloud, but his face remembered for him. By noon, the air smelled of snow not yet seen, a tin-cold tang. Thomas's fingers stiffened, then learned a new patience. He carried heat under his coat, the shared heat of told stories. Truth travelled that way, body to body like winter bread. Hunger gave it value, company gave it courage. They paused by the churchyard where stones kept the village's strictest accounts. Names paired to dates, debts cut to dust, the ledger nobody falsified. Thomas rested a palm on lichen, cool and soft as old wool. "We will do this before we end here," he said simply. Jacques grunted assent, the sound of iron agreeing with stone. In the square, the steward's notice rattled on its nail, thin as a threat. Thomas read the tidy cruelty, adjustments, arrears, winter surcharges. He felt anger rise, hot as kiln door breath, then cool to clarity. The words revealed themselves, not law, but habit dictating as decree. He folded the idea neatly and put it with the rest. That evening, he taught 2 boys the shapes of A and M by hearth smoke light. Ash on plank, finger for chalk, patience for ink. They laughed when their lines wobbled, then straightened with stubborn care. Ilara watched from the doorway, hands cupped around a steaming mug. "You're planting," she whispered. "They'll harvest when we're gone." Wind prowled the eaves. The cabin answered with its small grammar of creaks. Thomas stitched the day into memory, knot by careful knot. He did not yet know the pattern, but the thread held. When fear scratched at the door, he fed it a task and sent it away. The flame lowered its voice, confiding rather than pleading. Outside, the path wore the story of their boots, out, back, out again. The village listened, roofs cocked, lanes hushed, animals alert. Even the mill turned as if considering, wheel teeth counting differently. Thomas leaned the hoe by the door, metal cold, handle warm. Tools could be instruments of service or of sentence, tonight of service. He lay down with parchment tucked like a second rib, fragile and firm. The room smelled of wool and smoke, and the honest fatigue of a loud rest. Somewhere a fox barked, quick and bright. Somewhere a bell answered. He felt the village breathing with him, thread drawing through cloth. Tomorrow, he thought, we begin to write what no one will be able to unwrite. Morning returned, wrapped in a hush so thick it felt woven from fog and breath. Thomas rose before the hearth caught, struck flint, and watched light thread through smoke. The cabin smelled of ashes and damp wool, the scent of labor waiting. He stretched his fingers, ink-stained and cracked, and whispered his inventory of tasks. Each word steadied him like a prayer learned through repetition, not faith. Outside, Montfaucon shimmered beneath a thin frost, roofs dusted with pale sugar. The sky was pewter, waiting for color, the way paper waits for ink. Thomas walked toward the square, boots crunching the crisp topsoil, sound small but sure. A dog barked once, then thought better of it and curled back into straw. Even the animals had learned to trust the calm rhythm of this new order. Jacques was already at the forge, sleeves rolled, sparks sketching gold circles in the dim. The air burned sweet with metal and oak charcoal, a perfume of persistence. He handed Thomas a small box he'd hammered shut, iron-bound and modest. For the ledgers, he said, smiling without showing teeth. The box was warm from work, heavy with promise and perfectly square. They walked together toward the meeting hut, their breath twin ghosts in the cold. Thomas spoke of the new records he planned, rents, weights, and witness marks. Jacques nodded, his silence carrying more agreement than speech could manage. The village needed paper, but it also needed memory carved into habit. Law, Thomas thought, was nothing more than custom written in a steady hand. The meeting hut still smelled faintly of last night's broth, thyme, and smoke, clinging to the air. Villagers gathered in pairs, boots scuffing straw, faces open but cautious. The fire in the pit flickered low, light licking at soot-dark beams. Thomas placed the box on the table and felt eyes tighten around it. He lifted the lid and drew out the folded parchment, creased from many hands. Every name, he said, voice slow and deliberate, will be written here. A murmur passed through the room, part awe, part disbelief. He explained that justice needed record, not rumor, that truth must outlast breath. Ilara stepped forward first, her herbs rustling like dry applause. She pressed her thumb into the margin beside her name, leaving a green print of trust. Others followed. Remy, his cough muffled in his sleeve. Young Allard with his trembling hand. Each mark joined the last like beads strung on invisible thread. The sound of ink catching quill became the rhythm of collective memory. Outside, wind leaned against the shutters, curious then approving. Within, a new kind of quiet settled, structured, thoughtful, owned. Later, Thomas and Jacques carried the ledger to the old chapel for safekeeping. The chapel walls exhaled chill, stone smelling of candle smoke and centuries. Light fell in pale pools through cracked glass, motes turning like dust-born prayers. Thomas laid the ledger on the altar and touched it once, reverently. He whispered a line from Eustache, "Ink sanctifies when truth directs the hand." They sealed the box with wax from Ilara's own candle, thick and amber-hued. The scent of honey filled the small space, softening the austerity. Jacques pressed the signet ring, a borrowed seal from the bishop's clerk, into the wax. The crackle of cooling sealant sounded like finality achieved through patience. When they stepped outside, snow began its gentle decree over the fields. Afternoon light slanted gold through the clouds, gilding even the mud. Thomas walked the lane, passing cottages that seemed newly awake to their own walls. At each doorway, a greeting met him. A nod, a word, a loaf offered. The air carried a warmth no fire could explain, made of trust freshly kindled. This, he thought, was what freedom smelled like: smoke, bread, and relief. At the mill, the wheel turned slow, its groan a hymn of continuity. The miller, once wary, now met Thomas with a steady eye. He handed over the iron weights, newly calibrated by Jacques' forge. They rang when set down, clear, just, unembellished. Thomas noted the exchange, feeling the sound etch itself into memory. The sun was sinking when Remy arrived, cloak flung open, cheeks pink with cold. He carried a message. A steward from the Lord's keep had visited the fields. No threats yet, just questions, sharp, rehearsed, brittle like glass. Thomas felt no panic, only the old chill of vigilance stirring awake. "Let them come," he said. "We have records now. Let them read." That night, he wrote by lamplight until the wick guttered low. The quill rasped across the parchment, a whisper of resolve. Outside, wind poured at the thatch, snow hissed along the eaves. Each word felt heavier than the last, weighted with shared faith. He signed the page simply, "Witnessed in Montfaucon, by those once voiceless." Sleep came slowly, wrapped in the scent of tallow and ink. He dreamed of parchment unfolding like wings, pages beating toward dawn. The dreams did not frighten him. They merely insisted he continue. When he woke, light pressed pale against the shutters, insistent and pure. Another day had arrived to be documented, not endured. The following morning he visited Ilara, whose herbs now hung in neat ropes of green. Her house smelled of rosemary, damp soil, and mild triumph. She brewed tea so strong it burned in the best way, like earned comfort. They spoke of health, of weather, of patience learned late in life. Her laughter was low and rustling, like the turning of a well-read page. Across the yard, children traced letters in the snow with sticks, shouting their discoveries, an A backward but brave, a crooked M that still meant Montfaucon. Thomas watched, heart thick with something softer than pride. The future had begun in chalk and frost, not parchment and seal. Each clumsy stroke was a rebellion written in joy. At midday, Jacques brought new parchment, rough and uneven but serviceable. They unrolled it across the table, anchoring corners with stones. The ink smelled sharp and alive, like wet bark after rain. They planned to copy the entire record, in case of fire or theft. Thomas smiled. "Redundancy," he said, "is the guardian of truth." What by late afternoon, sleet whispered against the roof, more drizzle than threat. The fire hissed back, a quiet conversation of elements. Thomas's hands cramped, but he welcomed the ache. It meant continuity. Each copied line was a pulse, keeping justice alive on paper. The air shimmered faintly with heat, ink, and belief. At dusk, Remy returned with a letter bearing the Lord's seal. Thomas slit it open with his knife, wax flaking like brittle fruit skin. The words inside were measured and cold, offering a visit of inspection. Jacques read over his shoulder, jaw tightening, eyes calm. "Good," Thomas said softly. "Then we'll measure his words against ours." The next days passed in deliberate rhythm. Inspection preparations, ledger audits, rehearsed testimonies. Ilara gathered witnesses, Remy secured boundaries, Jacques tuned every scale. Evening smoke rose in confident plumes, straight-backed and proud. Montfaucon breathed as one, the village pulse steady and awake. Thomas felt tension settle into something cleaner. Readiness. When the steward arrived, his cloak carried the smell of foreign horses and inked wax. He dismounted slowly, eyes cold but uncertain amid the watching crowd. Thomas met him with a bow that was polite without being low. He opened the ledger on the table by the forge's glow. "Read freely," he said. "Here, even truth pays its tithe." Mayan the steward's eyes flicked across the entries, weights, rents, signatures, seals. The room's silence thickened, but not from fear. It thickened from pride. Outside, snow fell steady, soundless, sealing the roofs like parchment. When the man closed the book, his gloved fingers trembled slightly. He nodded once and left without a word of correction. The door shut. A single breath escaped every throat in the room. Then someone laughed, a brief, startled human sound. The laughter spread like sparks in dry grass until it became relief. Thomas sat down, hand still on the ledger, heart slow but certain. It wasn't victory, exactly. It was verification. That night, candles burned lower than ever, but lasted longer, as if pleased. The air in Montfaucon felt lighter, though the snow weighed every roof. Thomas looked through the window at the sky, pale with distant stars. He thought of Eustache, of ink drying on a colder night long ago. Justice, he realized, has the patience of parchment. It waits for the right hand. He closed the ledger, wrapped it in linen, and placed it in the iron box. The metal kissed shut with a soft click that sounded like a promise. The village slept under snow, their breath lifting like prayers. Thomas sat by the fire, its warmth steady and just. Tomorrow would bring more ink, more truth, and a peace worth documenting. Winter loosened its hold over Montfaucon with the soft patience of thawing wax. Icicles dripped from the eaves, each drop a clear measure of time reclaimed. Thomas sat by the open window, parchment spread across the table like a map of memory. The air smelled of wet earth and soot, honest sense of renewal. He traced the edges of the inked lines and thought, survival, written in careful strokes. Jacques entered without knocking, his boots leaving prints of slush on the floor. He carried new nails, tools, and the easy calm of a man no longer watched. "The bridge held," he said, half smiling, "and so did the people." Thomas nodded, feeling warmth spread through his chest like sunlight through wine. They didn't need grand declarations, just small continuities that spoke louder than oaths. Outside, the river had begun to run again, cracking its frozen shell in rhythmic bursts. Children threw pebbles into the current, testing its voice, laughing when it answered. Thomas leaned on the doorframe, the chill brushing his skin like memory. He felt the season shifting, not only in weather, but in the spirit of the land. Montfaucon was learning to breathe on its own again. Ilara's garden showed the first green shoots, thin and stubborn between stones. The air was filled with the faint scent of sage and thawed soil. She was teaching the children to plant in neat rows, their laughter the music of work. Thomas stood beside her, his hands clasped behind his back, content to watch. The quill had been his plough, the parchment, his field. At noon, the villagers gathered by the chapel, where the iron box rested beneath candlelight. The wax seal was untouched, the ledger safe within. Jacques unlocked it, and the faint smell of ink and honey rose like incense. Thomas turned each page with reverence, showing the names to those who had signed them. Every mark was a life reclaimed, a testament against silence. Remy read aloud, his voice gravelly but sure, pausing at each family's name. The villagers stood in the stillness, heads bowed not in submission but respect. The sound echoed softly against stone, like prayer rewritten as record. Thomas felt the air grow warm with pride, humility, and quiet belonging. For the first time, truth was public and protected. That evening, Thomas returned the ledger to its chest and sealed it anew. The wax gleamed in the firelight, thick and golden, pulsing faintly before it cooled. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping the thatch in patient rhythm. It smelled of iron and spring, earth awakening beneath its own weight. Thomas whispered thanks, not to heaven, but to endurance. Days turned gentler, stretched longer, carried laughter through open doors. Work no longer began with fear, but with the measured hum of routine. Even the animals seemed calmer, their movements unhurried and sure. The rhythm of life had changed, slower, steadier, grounded in fairness. Montfaucon had learned that peace was not a gift, it was maintenance. Thomas spent his mornings teaching letters to those who asked. The room smelled of ash, wax, and curiosity. He guided hands over the shapes, A for agreement, M for memory. When they struggled, he laughed softly, patient as the dawn. Learning was no longer forbidden, it was an act of devotion. Jacques forged new tools with lighter metal, balanced and clean. Each strike of his hammer was a hymn to precision. He no longer made weapons or chains, only instruments of harvest. The forge glowed amber in the dusk, its warmth spilling into the street. The sound of his labor had become the heartbeat of the village. Ilara's herbs dried in bunches across her ceiling, sweet and earthy. She hummed as she worked, voice low and steady like running water. People came to her not just for medicine, but for counsel. Her house smelled of thyme, ink, and trust, scents that did not exist in feudal ledgers. She had become Montfaucon's quiet healer, body and mind alike. Thomas kept correspondence with the bishop's clerk, sending records every season. The wax seals grew more ornate, their ribbons longer and richer in color. But his letters were simple, written in plain, steady words. "Peace continues," he wrote once, "and labor has become prayer." The bishop replied only once, "Then heaven has no complaint." One morning, fog rolled in from the hills, muffling even the bells. Thomas walked the boundary fields, tracing the new markers Jacques had set. The ground was soft underfoot, damp with renewal. He bent to touch the soil, cool and fine as flour between his fingers. It was theirs now, not by grace, but by record. He returned home to find a group of children at his table, drawing clumsy maps. Lines wavered like streams, letters tumbled into margins. He corrected nothing, only smiled. "Let the world be crooked before it's straight," he said. Their laughter lifted through the rafters, bright as morning. Ink stained the wood, but Thomas left it there, proof of growth. By midday, sunlight spilled gold through the cracks in the shutters. The cabin smelled of smoke, paper, and a faint trace of beeswax. Thomas wrote a line in the ledger's margin, "Freedom endures through remembrance." The quill scratched softly, echoing the rhythm of distant hammers. Every stroke felt like the tightening of a woven thread. Jacques stopped by at dusk, coat dusted with soot, eyes calm and content. They shared bread and stew, silent but companionable. Outside, a nightingale began to sing, unbothered by human noise. Thomas listened, smiling at the simple continuity of sound. "It sings because it can," he said. Jacques nodded. "So do we." Ilara joined them later, her hands smelling faintly of lavender. She brought a new candle, its wick wrapped in fine linen. When she lit it, the flame burned clear and tall, steady as conviction. They watched in silence, warmth spreading through the small room. That light, Thomas thought, was everything they had built. Spring deepened, fields shimmered with new green, damp and alive. The air was filled with hum, bees, tools, soft human chatter. Montfaucon had become a harmony of small labors and mutual care. No banners, no armies, just people learning to live without fear. The scent of tilled earth was the perfume of peace. The Lord's castle loomed still, distant but quieter now, its windows dark more often than lit. Power remained, but its shadow had shortened. Thomas rarely thought of Arnaud anymore. He existed like a ghost out of relevance. The true authority was the written word, the ledger sealed under wax. That book, Thomas mused, had done what no sword could. On the anniversary of the bishop's intervention, they held a small gathering. The chapel bells rang clear and low, their echo soft across the valley. People brought bread, herbs, bits of metal, symbols of their crafts. They placed them at the altar as offerings to justice, not to power. Thomas watched, humbled by the quiet reverence of the free. He spoke only once, briefly. "We record to remember, not to boast." His words drifted like ash, light but enduring. Outside, children played, their laughter stitching the air together. The sound was imperfect and utterly human, like all good things. Montfaucon no longer whispered, it conversed. That night, the sky cleared, revealing a scatter of cold stars. Thomas stepped outside, cloak wrapped close, and looked upward. The constellations seemed the same, yet something had changed below. The world had shifted a degree toward fairness, almost imperceptibly. He breathed deeply, and the air answered like an old friend. He sat by the hearth later, adding a final note to the ledger. The ink endures, the people remember, the land forgives. He closed the book, pressed his hand over the seal, and smiled. No monument would bear their names, but their story had roots. Roots, he thought, last longer than banners. The candle burned low, its flame bowing gently before sleep. The room smelled of pine ash, parchment, and earned rest. Jacques' laughter from outside drifted in like a familiar song. Thomas leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the pulse of life. Even silence had become a companion now, not a fear. When the fire dwindled to embers, he whispered a final benediction to the night. "May truth outlive every lord who forgets it." The wind shifted, carrying warmth instead of chill through the cracks. Snow no longer fell on Montfaucon, only memory, gentle and bright. And with that, the village slept under the watchful light of its own history. Spring unfolded in Montfaucon like a sigh of relief, slow, fragrant and deliberate. The fields shimmered with wet promise, each furrow catching morning light. Thomas stood beside the brook, listening to the hush of water over stone. The air smelled of moss and thawed iron, sweetened by new grass. Every sound felt softer now, as if the land itself had exhaled forgiveness. Children ran barefoot through puddles, their laughter scattering like startled birds. Jacques leaned on his hammer outside the forge, smiling without a word. Ilara's herbs dried in the sun, leaves whispering in a language older than scripture. Thomas wrote their names in the ledger again, not out of duty, but affection. It wasn't record-keeping anymore. It was remembrance. The forge's rhythm had changed, slower, deeper, more content. Metal met anvil with the ease of a song that knows its refrain. Jacques shaped not chains, but hinges, gates, and ploughs, tools of continuation. He said little, yet his work carried an eloquence Thomas admired. Each spark felt like punctuation in a story nearly complete. Thomas spent his mornings in quiet observation. He noted the way light entered cottages, steady and unafraid. He heard the shift in laughter, no longer cautious but careless in the best way. He felt peace in the calluses of his own hands, built by labor chosen, not imposed. Freedom, he realized, was not loud. It was simply persistent. At noon, he walked to the hill above the village, where the wind always arrived first. The grass bent low, brushing his boots with a sigh of recognition. Below, Montfaucon spread like a tapestry of smoke, roofs, and glinting tools. From this height, even the Lord's castle looked small, softened by distance. Thomas smiled. Power, he thought, only looked large when you knelt before it. Ilara joined him with a small bundle of herbs tied in cloth. "They're for healing," she said, "but also for memory." The scent of rosemary and mint filled the air between them. Thomas breathed it in, thinking of Eustache, of parchment and prayer. The past lingered, but it no longer ruled. It instructed. Later that day, a traveller stopped in Montfaucon seeking rest and water. He was young, weary, his cloak torn by long roads and rumour. Over supper, he spoke of other villages still bound by debt and deceit. Thomas listened, each word like an echo of an older pain. Hope, he knew, was only valuable if it could be shared. He gave the traveller a copy of their ledger's charter, their small charter of freedom. The paper smelled faintly of wax and smoke, edges browned by handling. "Take this," Thomas said, "not as proof, but as pattern." The young man's eyes brightened, a reflection of possibility. Change, Thomas realized, was contagious when written clearly. After the traveller departed, the village gathered by the forge. Jacques read a passage from the ledger aloud, his voice steady and plain. "Every name deserves light," he said, and paused, letting silence agree. The people nodded, some smiling, some tearful, all awake in a new way. It wasn't ceremony, it was continuity. The next day dawned with silver mist and birdsong weaving through it. Thomas wrote again, his quill gliding with patient grace. The parchment glowed amber under the slant of morning sun. Each stroke felt like planting, deliberate, grounded, alive. Ink, he thought, was the soil where truth took root. At midday, the bell of the chapel rang once, a low, honest tone. Its echo rolled through the fields, a sound both human and divine. The air carried warmth, carrying with it the smell of wheat in early bloom. Montfaucon answered not with fear, but with laughter in reply. Even bells, once symbols of power, had joined the chorus of peace. Remy built a wooden crossroad sign with Jacques, marking paths outward. One arrow read, Abbé, another Ville Haute, a third, simply Hope. Thomas smiled at the last one, shaking his head but saying nothing. Every road now pointed somewhere worth walking. The wind turned the sign slowly, like a compass without borders. At night, the village glowed with lamplight instead of fear. Cottages pulsed with soft gold behind window glass. From his doorway, Thomas watched shadows move inside, alive with purpose. The sound of spoons, murmurs, and lullabies blended into a gentle symphony. He thought, this is what civilization sounds like when it remembers kindness. Ilara began keeping her own ledger, recipes, remedies, births. She asked Thomas to check her handwriting, laughing at her uneven letters. He refused to correct them. Perfection, he said, forgets the hand that wrote. Her ink smelled of sage and honey, a scent more enduring than seal or stamp. It was history rewritten through nurture. Jacques carved a small plaque for the chapel wall. It read, "Truth was our labour, faith was our reward." The letters were rough but proud, cut deep into the wood. Thomas traced them once, feeling their texture like memory made tactile. He didn't pray, but he stood still long enough to mean it. The river swelled with melted snow, loud and restless. Its current carried bits of bark, petals and forgotten things. Thomas tossed in a broken quill, letting it drift downstream. Symbols, he thought, must sometimes be released to remain sacred. The water caught it, swallowed it, and moved on. Montfaucon prospered quietly. The harvest was modest but fair, trade steady, tempers even. Children now learned their letters before their chores. The Lord's messengers still rode past, but now they tipped their heads in courtesy. Power had learned manners, or perhaps humility. Thomas's beard had silvered, his fingers trembled slightly as he wrote. Yet the lines he drew were straighter than ever. He no longer wrote for fear of loss, but for the pleasure of keeping. Each entry was a conversation with time. Parchment aged, but purpose didn't. He began a new section titled Chronicles of Montfaucon's Peace. The ink spread evenly, unhurried. He wrote of crops, of new marriages, of laughter heard at dusk. He wrote not as a witness to oppression, but as custodian of calm. Even quiet, he realized, deserved record. One morning, he received a letter sealed with a foreign crest. It bore the bishop's mark and the scent of travel, dust, oil, and distance. The bishop thanked Montfaucon for preserving faith through law. Thomas smiled, folding it carefully into the ledger's back. Recognition was nice, but not necessary. The people already knew. That evening, clouds gathered violet at the horizon, heavy with rain. Thomas sat by the fire, writing slower now, savouring the scratch of quill. Each word left behind a trace of gratitude, faint as breath on glass. When lightning flared, it illuminated the quill, the hand, the calm face. Even storms, he thought, bow to those who keep records. Rain came hard and pure, drumming roofs and washing the air clean. The smell of soil and smoke fused into something ancient, almost holy. People stayed indoors, fires bright, stories retold over bread. Thomas listened to the rain's even rhythm, steady as his own pulse. It was the world confirming its balance. When the sky cleared, dawn broke wide and forgiving. Mist curled off the fields like silk pulled from water. Thomas stepped outside, breathing deeply, letting sunlight find his face. He thought of every name in the ledger, every thumbprint, every promise kept. He whispered to the wind, "We were never small." The village stirred slowly, smoke rising like verses into the calm air. Jacques waved from the forge. Ilara hung herbs in morning light. Thomas raised his hand in return, the gesture simple, complete. The ledger waited on the table inside, open but unguarded. Truth finally no longer needed defense. It had become habit. He sat once more at his desk, the quill resting by the candle. Outside the river hummed, and the world went on, balanced and kind. Thomas closed the ledger, tied it with soft twine, and smiled. He didn't need to write the last line. Montfaucon was already living it. The story had ended, but the piece it wrote would keep on speaking. Thomas and Jacques stepped away from the forge, carrying with them the weight of their secret and the lingering scent of coal. The air was thick and damp, filled with the low hum of wind sweeping over thatched roofs, warning of an approaching storm. Thomas's urgency was contagious, and Jacques, seasoned by a lifetime of hardship, began to see the old sorrows of the village in a new light. The injustices of Montfaucon were no longer misfortunes. They were a pattern. Together they resolved to speak with the oldest serfs in the village, those whose memories were the last living threads connecting Montfaucon to the days when its people had been free. Yet their approach would have to be as delicate as a spider's web forming in a window corner. Their first visit was to Dame Ilara, a widow known for her knowledge of herbs and her near-constant silence. She lived on the edge of the forest, where the air smelled of wet soil and wild plants. They found her weaving wicker, the soft rustle of intertwining fibers, creating the only melody in that quiet space. The touch of the dry, flexible strands in her hands contrasted sharply with the roughness of the life she had endured. Her clear, penetrating eyes seemed to see through both words and fear. Thomas didn't mention the parchment. Instead, he asked about her late husband, a skilled craftsman. Ilara's voice, low and rasped like wind through reeds, carried a story of slow ruin. Her husband's father, she said, had lost their small plot of land after failing to pay a repair fee imposed by the lord for use of his mill, the only one in the region. Forced to offer their land as collateral, The family had eventually pledged themselves in servitude as well. The use of the lord's mills, ovens and presses, known as banalities, was one of the chief mechanisms of economic enslavement in the feudal system, often leading to debts that could never be repaid. Ilara's story spoke not of one great betrayal, but of a quiet suffocation, an invisible hand tightening over generations. The lord's control of essential infrastructure had become a weapon. Even after years of labor meant to repay the debt, Lord Arnaud never returned the land, claiming that the value of the corvée barely covered the interest. Despite the bitterness of the memory, Ilara's calm dignity gave Thomas clarity. The injustice of Montfaucon was systemic, woven through a web of legitimate obligations that were, in truth, traps. Next, they visited Remy, a former soldier who had returned from the Lord's wars, crippled and withdrawn, now making baskets for a living. His hut smelled of straw and wood, comforting yet tinged with the dry rasp of his persistent cough, a relic of long campaigns. After some hesitation, and after breaking a piece of hard, dark bread that Thomas had brought, Remy opened up. His family's fall, he said, began when his grandfather, a free landholder or franklin, was conscripted to serve in the Lord's army during an invasion. The cost of equipment, horses and upkeep often drove small landowners into debt to their lords, turning the duty of defense into a slow form of bondage. Remy's tale added a new shade to the injustice, servitude as the price of protection. When his grandfather returned from war, he lacked the means to farm again. Overwhelmed by taxes meant to compensate the lord for his absence, he surrendered both his land and his liberty in exchange for a place as a serf. The contrast between the bravery of a soldier and the humiliation of his descendants weighed heavily in the air. The rough bread crumbled on Thomas's tongue with the taste of survival itself. Different as their stories were, they all led to the same truth: freedom and land taken not by conquest, but by law, craft, and deceit. With the testimonies of Ilara and Remy, Thomas and Jacques began to see the pattern more clearly. Montfaucon's servitude hadn't been born of swords or conquest, but from a slow, legalized crushing of family economies. The spider's web of feudal power wasn't seen at first, but when the strands of memory were joined, the design became undeniable. Thomas's forged emphyteusis was no isolated injustice. It was a piece of a much larger system, the foundation upon which Lord Arnaud's power truly stood. As their conversations deepened, a quiet bond formed between the three, a trust built on shared truth. The mystery was no longer fog, but fragile certainty, beautiful and dangerous. Rain began to fall hard on Remy's thatched roof, its rhythm muffling the rest of the world and wrapping them in a cocoon of complicity. Thomas breathed in the scent of wet earth and felt the cold touch of damp air against his skin. The moment felt sacred. He knew now that his fight was not only about his parchment, it was about giving voice to all of Montfaucon, silenced for generations beneath the weight of tradition. The silence that followed the rain inside Remy's cottage was thick with new purpose, a shared resolve binding Thomas, Jacques, and old Ilara, who had joined them. The smell of wet earth rose from the packed clay floor, and the touch of Thomas's fingers on the creased, mold-scented parchment felt like touching the living history of Montfaucon itself. They now understood that the legal deception that had turned free families into serfs wasn't a mere twist of fate. It was the foundation upon which the entire fief rested. Medieval servitude, they realized, was largely an invention of debt and documentation, a perverse exchange where the loss of freedom was sold as protection, a distortion of the very idea of feudal security that time had hardened into tradition. They began to outline their plan, recognizing that Lord Arno's power relied on division and silence among his people. Their first goal was to spread truth discreetly, using the invisible networks of trust that already existed, women weaving together in their cottages and men working side by side in the fields. The rhythm of this quiet resistance would have to grow as slowly and imperceptibly as a tree, so as not to rouse suspicion from the overseer or the castle guards. Thomas emphasized one subtle truth: the difference between a servus, bound to the land, and a villanus, a supposedly free peasant, was often only legal fiction. In practice, their obligations were nearly identical, blurring the line between freedom and bondage, making exploitation easier to disguise. Ilara, with her quiet wisdom, warned them not to speak openly of stolen rights or ancient nobility. Such words could be branded as sedition or heresy against the order sanctioned by both church and lord. Instead, she advised a gentler approach. Speak of our grandparents' memories, of the harvest promised and the harvest delivered. Ground the truth in the tangible: lost crops, heavier tithes, broken promises. Her calm, steady voice became Thomas's compass, steering him away from dangerous rhetoric and toward practical, unassailable evidence, economic facts that even the Lord's men could not deny. Thomas explained what the parchment contained: the forged emphyteusis, a long-term lease that masqueraded as a sale, its price never fully paid, trapping the former owners in endless debt. He described the texture of the parchment, its dry, brittle surface, the musty scent of archives, and the intricate Latin script that Brother Eustache had painstakingly translated. He also shared a chilling detail. Lord Arno's personal scribe was rumoured to be skilled at falsifying documents and altering census records, a man who controlled the legal memory of the fief, the silent right hand of oppression. Their plan was to gather smaller stories of injustice, like the Dubois family's grain debt or Remy's lost lands, to build a collective case that didn't depend solely on Thomas's parchment, which could easily be dismissed as personal forgery. The goal was to show that the problem wasn't misfortune, it was policy. The noble grain of the wooden table beneath the parchment contrasted sharply with the poverty around it. A perfect metaphor for truth hidden beneath layers of misery. Jacques, the old blacksmith, took on the task of speaking with the younger men, those whose labor was most exploited and whose anger smoldered the hottest. He would use the image of the Lord's mill as his symbol of injustice. Each time a serf brought grain to grind, he paid a portion to the Lord, and as Jacques always said, the scales never favored the poor. The creaking rhythm of the millstones, once just background noise, now became the sound of oppression itself, and for Thomas, its beat transformed into the cadence of resistance. The calm that followed the rain felt like the stillness before a storm. Thomas watched the drops slide down the window, feeling the cold dampness of the air, and understood that the feudal system was far more than a simple exchange of land for labor. It was a machine for controlling information, for bending law into chains. Servitude had been sold as destiny, not imposed as theft. And as he looked at his companions, the widow, the soldier, the smith, he saw not weakness, but the beginnings of something far greater, the quiet dismantling of a perfectly oiled machine, one hidden mechanism at a time. In the days that followed, Thomas immersed himself in the slow rhythm of labor and the feverish discretion of gathering information. The rough feel of the Lord's tools in his hands contrasted sharply with the precision of his thoughts as he pieced together the details of the fraud. He and his companions focused on listening, really listening, to the quiet laments of the other serfs, searching not only for tales of hardship, but for patterns that echoed the same legal injustices Thomas had uncovered. Nearly every family in Montfaucon, they learned, had lost its allodial freedom through debts of grain, unpaid mill fees, banalities, or crushing military obligations. All of these paths led to a single truth: the use of law and written record as instruments of enslavement. The deeper Thomas delved, the clearer it became that feudalism's strength lay not in the castle's walls, but in the scribe's quill. He thought of his own family, whose land had been taken more than a century ago, and realized that servitude was not just inherited, it was self-perpetuating. The faint smoke of hearth fires mingled with the sweet scent of freshly cut grass, carrying on the air the unspoken memory of centuries of unpaid labor. The nobility's power, he understood, depended entirely on the people's ignorance. Knowledge and writing were privileges Lord Arno guarded with almost sacred zeal. A key historical reality surfaced during their search: the tallage, a tax the Lord imposed on serfs in grain or coin, often arbitrarily, sometimes doubled without warning in times of war or noble expense. Many, like the family of a young man named Henri, traced their bondage to a single year of bad harvest, when they couldn't pay the tallage. That quiet contradiction, the Lord's supposed duty of protection turned into financial predation, was, Thomas realized, the very core of feudal hypocrisy. Their secret meetings became small rituals of resolve. At night, under the watchful eyes of owls and the chill of dew-soaked grass, they gathered near the river, where the murmur of water masked their voices. The cool, damp soil beneath their palms grounded their fragile alliance. Thomas translated the legal Latin of the parchment into plain words, showing how law itself had been twisted into a weapon. Again and again he reminded them, the sin was not devotion to God, it was the deceit of Lord Arno. They soon began to suspect that the Lord might keep a registry, a great book of accounts recording every debt and pledge within the fief. If such a ledger existed, it could prove beyond doubt that Thomas's parchment was not an isolated document, but part of a vast and deliberate scheme. The faint spark of hope among them glowed warmer each night. The truth, in their minds, became a vision, a long list of names, the proof that injustice was not individual suffering, but collective theft. Remy, with the calm pragmatism of a soldier, urged caution. A revolt would feed the gallows, he warned, but a united village, armed with proof, could force a reckoning. His words settled over them like the hush before dawn. Even nobles, he reasoned, feared numbers. The power of Thomas's parchment was not in its ink, but in its ability to unite hearts long accustomed to submission. Thomas listened and nodded. His gaze drifted toward the darkness beyond the fields, where the faint outline of the castle stood like a silent adversary. The scent of crushed grass rose around him, mingling with the cool breath of the night, a scent that now carried the weight of a vow. Truth, however old or buried, could not remain silent forever. He tucked the parchment close to his chest, guarding it as one guards a treasure. The time for reflection was ending. Ahead waited movement, quiet, deliberate movement, and the coming confrontation with power itself, in the cold stone heart of Lord Arno's castle. Thomas's transformation from resigned serf to keeper of a dangerous secret had become the only force driving him forward. The next morning, the air was sharp and cold, the first breath of winter. The scent of frost burning the fallen leaves filled the valley, and soon the rare sound of horses' hooves echoed through Montfaucon. It was a sign of disruption. Lord Arno was leaving the castle for a hunt in the nearby woods. His absence was both an opportunity and a threat. The plan that had once been abstract was now solidifying, and the tension between caution and urgency hung over the village like the pale morning fog. The hunt's sensory chaos, the barking of hounds, the blare of horns, the shouting of men, contrasted with the slow silence of peasant life. Using the distraction, Thomas, Jacques, and Remy made their way toward the castle, where the guards were fewer than usual. Their goal was not open confrontation, but quiet investigation, to find the Lord's scribe and, if fortune allowed, the records that proved the pattern of deceit. The castle loomed with cold towers and damp stone, breathing the smell of iron, wax, and age-old power. When Thomas touched the wall, the chill of it ran through him. It was the tangible weight of what they were defying. His knowledge of medieval architecture now became crucial. From the builders he'd spoken with, he knew that most castles held a central tower, the keep, which served as both last defense and administrative heart. It was there, in the scribe's chamber, that the written bones of the fief were kept, the faint sound of water trickling through the moat, and the cries of crows circling the courtyard filled the emptiness around them. Every echo magnified their fear, yet Thomas's resolve grew stronger with every step into the unknown. Outwardly calm, he concealed the storm inside him by focusing on the slow rhythm of his breath and the faint, smoky scent of spent torches. They entered the castle under the guise of delivering firewood to the kitchen, and with the quiet aid of a sympathetic cook who had heard Ilara's whispered tale, they slipped into the administrative wing. This part of the castle felt entirely different, colder, stiller. The air was heavy with the smell of parchment, ink, and sealing wax, the perfume of bureaucracy and control. They found the scribe's chamber, a small, narrow scriptorium lit only by a tall, thin window. On the table lay an open ledger, its pages lined with neat, deliberate handwriting, records of obligations, taxes, and debts. Thomas felt the grain of the leather cover under his fingertips, as if it absorbed the centuries of Montfaucon's history into its skin. He and Jacques began to turn the pages quickly, their hearts pounding in sync with the soft rustle of parchment, fear and discovery twisting together. What they found confirmed everything. Countless entries of unpaid banalities and tallages, debts that, written in tiny, careful Latin, had been converted into hereditary servitude. It was the same legal trick that had destroyed Thomas's family generations ago. Thomas's calm deepened into something solemn. This was no longer about his lineage, it was about all of them. The ledger was the skeleton of feudalism itself, exposing servitude not as divine order but as legal machinery. In that moment, their entire world inverted. They were no longer subjects begging for mercy, but witnesses holding proof of a crime. From afar, the abbey bells struck the hour, a stark reminder that time was slipping away. They did not steal the book. Instead, Thomas took a small scrap of parchment from Brother Eustache and, using a piece of charcoal, copied the passage that tied the tallage debts to hereditary bondage, a cold, written confession of oppression carved by the Lord's own hand. Thomas's hurried copy of the crucial lines from the feudal ledger carried the sharp smell of charcoal and the urgency of stolen time. The cold stone of the scriptorium pressed against his knees as he worked, its chill biting at his skin, a perfect counterpoint to the heat of discovery in his chest. They left the castle as quietly as they had entered, blending in among the few remaining servants, carrying with them silent proof that Montfaucon's servitude was not destiny, but the result of deliberate deception. The air outside felt lighter despite the cold, proof that knowledge itself could alter reality. The calm that settled over Thomas was no longer the calm of submission, but of purpose fully awakened. Their escape was marked by the faint barking of hunting dogs in the distance, a reminder of Lord Arno's absence, which gave them time, though not safety. The serenity with which they walked back to the village was its own quiet act of rebellion. What was confirmed in that moment was one of the great truths of the Middle Ages. In a world where most could not read or write, the written word was power. Those who controlled parchment and ink, lords and clerics, controlled both history and law. The peasants, bound to oral memory and custom, lived at the mercy of records they could not see or contest. Thomas and Jacques understood that the next step had to go beyond Montfaucon. The parchment and its copies needed to reach an authority outside the Lord's grasp, someone capable of arbitration. The ideal figure was the bishop of the neighboring diocese, whose ecclesiastical authority often mediated disputes between nobles and commoners, especially those involving usury and moral injustice. They planned to travel under cover of darkness, using the timing of the hunt's return to mask their absence. The forest's dense, earthy scent would be both guide and protection. Night descended on Montfaucon, heavy and cold, carrying the smoky perfume of burning wood from distant hearths. The village lay in silence, but beneath that quiet hope stirred like an ember. Thomas gathered Ilara and Remy by the fire to entrust them with the documents, the parchment from his grandfather, Eustache's careful translation, and his own copy of the ledger's damning lines. "Guard them with your lives," he said softly, "in case we don't return." The flickering light of the fire was the only illumination in that secret meeting, and to Thomas it seemed a living symbol, the fragile flame of justice they had dared to ignite. Thomas's composure stood in contrast to the nervous energy of his companions. He spoke of his family's long descent into bondage, reminding them that servitude had taken generations to take root, and freedom would demand the same patience, beginning with one brave step. The coarse wool of his clothes brushed against his skin, grounding him in the present, reminding him of the warmth he risked losing. Then, with Jacques at his side, he slipped into the darkness, following the winding paths that led away from the feudal lands. The plan was simple, yet perilous. Walk through the night, unseen, and reach the episcopal city at dawn, when the morning bustle would cloak their arrival. The sound of their footsteps on the damp grass was soft and steady, a rhythm of quiet resolve. Beneath the wide, star-filled sky, the world seemed vast and breathing, and the fief of Lord Arnaud, so immense in their daily lives, now appeared small, just one fragment of a greater order where, however rare, justice still had a place. Thomas and Jacques' night journey was an exercise in silence and introspection. They walked along hardened dirt roads, feeling the cold, uneven ground beneath their worn boots. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of their footsteps and the faint whisper of the wind threading through bare branches. As they approached the episcopal city at dawn, a thin mist settled over the fields, carrying the damp scent of stone and sewage, the unmistakable aroma of a larger medieval settlement. The focus of the moment narrowed to one simple gesture, one object, the goose feather Thomas carried with him, the quill brother Eustache had given him. It was more than a writing tool. It was the tangible symbol of the power he now sought to challenge, the fragile key to his freedom. Thomas's gaze lingered on the quill. It wasn't a decorative plume or a hunter's trophy, it was a working instrument, its tip carefully trimmed for precise calligraphy. He felt how light and delicate it was in his hand, and yet how immense its moral weight had become. The quill was the opposite of the hoe. It turned thought into law. For a serf to possess such an object was an act of rebellion. That subtle contrast, the brute strength of labor against the lethal finesse of ink, was the revelation of his entire journey. He recalled a story Eustache once told him. Before being used to write an important document, every quill was consecrated with a silent prayer, a plea that the words it would write be truthful and just. Writing, then, was not merely a skill, it was a sacred duty. That memory transformed the quill in Thomas's hand into something more than a tool. It became a talisman against Lord Arnaud's lies. In the stillness of morning, His own thoughts seemed almost audible, and he could feel the chill of dew on his boots as the first sunlight warmed his face. The description of the quill unfolded in his mind with poetic precision, the soft, almost translucent base of the feather giving way to a rigid, resilient shaft, its pale grey-white colour stained by the dark ink Eustache had used for notes. Whenever Thomas felt fear or uncertainty, he touched the quill, a small ritual of confidence, a gesture that reconnected him with the scribe's wisdom and the abbey's authority. It reminded him that true power didn't rest in the sword, but in knowledge and law. One fact Eustache had taught him lingered sharply. In medieval times, parchment and ink were costly, reserved for the few. The scarcity of written record was what made literacy, and thus power, so concentrated in the hands of nobles and clergy. For a peasant to carry both parchment and quill was nearly sacrilege, a trespass into the sacred realm of the learned. The quill, then, was not just an object. It was material proof that Thomas had crossed the forbidden threshold of knowledge. As they entered the episcopal city, the scent of incense drifted from the cathedral, mingling with the cool touch of the stone-paved streets, wider and smoother than those of Montfaucon. The sense of grandeur, of belonging to something larger than the feudal world he'd known, filled Thomas with quiet awe. He tightened his grip on the quill, feeling its feather-light weight and the heavy truth it carried. A serene determination washed over him. He was ready to tell Montfaucon's story, armed not with force, but with the silent, enduring power of the written word. The presence of the goose quill in Thomas's hands was a quiet act of defiance against the ignorance imposed upon the serfs. As he and Jacques made their way deeper into the episcopal city, the tolling of the cathedral bell, deeper and more resonant than Montfaucon's, filled the air with a sense of permanence and sacred order that their village had never known. The cool touch of the cobblestones, now gently warmed by the morning sun, reminded Thomas of the cold weight of the written injustices he carried. Together, they sought the residence of Bishop Eloy, a prelate known for his strict adherence to canon law, particularly his condemnation of usury and excessive oppression of the peasantry, a subject often debated in medieval councils. They were led into the inner courtyard of the episcopal residence, where the scent of flowers and medicinal herbs hung softly in the air, a striking contrast to the staleness of the streets outside. After a long wait, they were received by one of the bishop's assistants, a young canon whose boredom was evident at the sight of two rustic peasants. Yet his indifference faltered when Thomas, in a slow, deliberate gesture, withdrew the parchment and its copies. The feel of the paper in the canon's hands, and his astonishment at seeing a serf holding documents of such complexity, was Thomas's first small victory. When he noticed Brother Eustache's handwriting, the young cleric realized the accusation bore the unmistakable weight of Saint Grégoire Abbey's authority. Even as the quill remained tucked away, it served as Thomas's mental anchor, a silent reminder of purpose. He explained that the servitude of many Montfaucon families was not the result of divine fate, but of a recurring legal deceit. He spoke of his own lineage, how his family's name and freedom had been stripped away by a forged debt as one thread in a broader tapestry of corruption. His words painted in slow and deliberate rhythm the cruel poetry of law twisted into chains, how lines of ink had trapped generations through unfair fines and falsified contracts. The canon, shifting uneasily, recognized a truth that had echoed through church history: the peace of God and the truce of God, ecclesiastical movements meant to restrain feudal violence and protect the weak, especially peasants, from the greed of their lords. Bishop Eloy, in addressing such a case, would be acting within the very spirit of Christian justice, which so often served as the serf's only shield. The recognition of this moral context gave Thomas's plea a solemn legitimacy that no local tribunal could match. When Thomas finished, his voice was calm, his conviction steady. He felt the soft edge of the quill against his chest, like a charm of courage. The canon, visibly unsettled by the clarity of the evidence and the gravity of the accusations, promised to deliver the documents directly to Bishop Eloy. In that moment, Thomas felt something new, a quiet belonging, a sense that his voice, carried now through the authority of the written word, had finally reached a place of true power. Between the act of denunciation and the response yet to come, silence filled the courtyard, a silence not of fear, but of sacred anticipation. The goose quill, carefully kept close to Thomas's chest, was the quiet center of his composure as he and Jacques made their way to the episcopal palace. The sound of morning prayers echoing from the cathedral brought a steady rhythm to their thoughts, and the scent of incense mingled with the crisp morning air. The grandeur of the city, the stone houses, the bustling square, the colors of trade and devotion, stood in stark contrast to Montfaucon's rustic simplicity. That contrast, Thomas thought, was proof of the power he hoped to enlist. Jacques' brief touch on his shoulder, a silent gesture of brotherhood, reminded him that courage was never carried alone. Thomas studied the people of the city. Their movements were quicker, their clothes finer, and even their posture seemed lighter. Freedom, he realized, was not merely a legal status. It was something visible, a rhythm in the body, an ease in the spine. He remembered Ilara's story about hope, how it was like the last strand of wool on a loom, thin but strong enough to hold the fabric together. That quiet metaphor nourished him, turning the fragile quill in his pocket into a weapon against the forged laws that bound his people. What gave him strength was the historical truth he had learned from Eustache, the growing power of ecclesiastical courts during the High Middle Ages. These curiae episcopales didn't rule only on matters of faith. They judged morality in contracts, condemning usury and fraud when they violated Christian justice. The Church, often the only force capable of opposing a noble's will, was the final refuge of the oppressed. This understanding grounded Thomas's mission in both law and faith. It was no longer just rebellion, it was righteousness. When they reached the palace, the smell of polished wax and the solemn stillness of guards sent a chill down Thomas's spine. Yet he pressed his fingers against the quill, feeling the hardened shaft beneath his touch, a small but powerful reminder of transformation. The quill, once tempered by fire to harden its point, mirrored his own evolution, from a passive serf into an agent of truth. Its delicate strength embodied his journey, proof that fragility, under purpose, becomes resilience. They were led into a waiting hall where silence reigned, broken only by the faint clinking of dishes and the distant scent of spiced food from the kitchens, a fragrance of luxury unknown in Montfaucon. The waiting tested Thomas's composure. He watched sunlight stream through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like thoughts suspended in time. Each slow breath steadied him. He knew that the fate of dozens of families rested on his ability to turn cold documents into a living human story of injustice. The quill, almost invisible in his hand, was his focus, a bridge between the illiteracy of the fields and the authority of written law. In a few moments he would use the instrument of power to challenge power itself, a poetic reversal of the feudal order. A deep calm filled him. And when the call finally came, when a servant opened the door and announced that Bishop Eloy would see them, Thomas rose, quill and parchments in hand, carrying not just evidence, but faith. He stepped forward with the stillness of a man who understood both the weight of truth and the risk of speaking it aloud. The audience with Bishop Anselm was not the theatrical confrontation Thomas had feared. but rather an austere exchange where silence and the weight of words held greater power than any raised voice. The bishop, a venerable man with sharp, discerning eyes, received the two serfs in a stone chamber that smelled faintly of incense and old books, an atmosphere that seemed to magnify the gravity of the moment. Thomas, feeling the smooth chill of marble beneath his bare feet, began not with his family's parchment, but with the broader human story of Montfaucon, the spread of injustice, the collective burden of servitude imposed through false debts, and the abuse of banalities. He connected the personal to the communal, explaining how the forged enfitus that ruined his own lineage fit into the larger pattern of exploitation recorded in the copied pages of the feudal register. Using Brother Eustatius' quill as a silent pointer, he indicated the passages that revealed how unpaid fees for using the Lord's mill and oven had been converted into hereditary bondage. At first, his voice trembled, but as he spoke of the family's suffering, it gained strength and clarity. The cold air of the chamber stood in sharp contrast to the heat of his growing conviction, something Bishop Anselm listened to with patient, measured focus. After hearing Thomas and Jacques' testimonies and examining the documents with the aid of his own scribe, the bishop felt the full weight of their evidence. The realization that Montfaucon's injustice was born not of brute force, but of legal manipulation, made the case an ideal matter for ecclesiastical intervention. The Church, after all, had long condemned usury and the moral enslavement of the poor. The bishop's grave expression was Thomas's first true victory. Spiritual power had recognized the truth of the serfs. Thomas recounted the stories of the Dubois family and of Rémy's ancestors, showing how the loss of freedom and land always followed the same ritual: debt, inability to repay, and the gradual transformation of obligation into inheritance. The deeper revelation came when he presented proof that Lord Arnauld had consistently refused to honor the droit de rachat, the right of redemption that allowed some serfs to buy back their freedom. This refusal revealed the nobleman's intent to keep peasants permanently bound to the soil, reducing them to mere extensions of his estate. Bishop Anselm reminded Thomas of a central teaching of the Church, rooted in the doctrine of St. Thomas Aquinas, that upheld the ideals of just labor and the life of justice, condemning both usury and predatory exploitation. While feudalism was tolerated as part of the world's order, it was morally condemned when built on deceit and the violation of Christian charity. The bishop felt the weight of duty to intervene not only in the name of law, but of faith, for Lord Arnault's actions were as much a spiritual offense as a worldly crime. With calm authority, Bishop Anselm declared his intention to send an emissary to Lord Arnauld, carrying the quill and the copied records as symbols of truth and reconciliation. His voice, firm yet serene, carried the promise of action. The scent of incense thickened, almost like a blessing upon Thomas's mission. What had begun as one man's private grievance had now become a moral cause, a plea for justice not only of law, but of the soul. Bishop Anselm appointed Brother Lucas, a young friar well-versed in ecclesiastical law, as his emissary. Before setting out for Lord Arnault's estate, Lucas gathered Thomas and Jacques for one final instruction. The tolling of the cathedral bells marked the hour with solemn rhythm, and the faint scent of lamp oil from the sacristy filled the air with quiet expectation. Lucas explained the strategy with calm precision. They would rely not only on the moral authority of the Church, but also on the nobleman's fear that the matter might reach higher courts, where scandal could tarnish his reputation, erode his allies' support, and even draw the attention of the crown. Thomas felt the cool, polished touch of the bishop's ring, which Lucas carried as the symbol of his mission, and he realized that the power of a symbol could outweigh that of any sword. The friar spoke to him about the unique strength of ecclesiastical courts in countering feudal oppression. Unlike secular tribunals, these courts could impose spiritual penalties, most notably excommunication, a punishment dreaded by every medieval noble, for it meant not only social isolation, but also eternal damnation. That invisible fear of excommunication had become Thomas's unspoken weapon. Brother Lucas prepared for the journey, carrying not only Thomas's documents, but also a formal letter from Bishop Anselm. The letter, written in measured but firm language, referenced the human stories of fraud and usury in Montfaucon, and invoked the Church's doctrine of just labor and the Christian duty of mercy, from every lord toward his people. Watching Lucas ready himself, Thomas felt warmth rise within him again, a quiet flame of hope contrasting with the cold stone beneath his bare feet. The quill of Eustache, now entrusted to the friar, gleamed faintly in the morning light, its feather a symbol of truth given wings. The return journey for Thomas and Jacques felt lighter. They walked with the peace of men who had laid a great burden upon stronger shoulders. The scent of damp earth and the whisper of wind through the trees no longer spoke of bondage, but of a land poised for redemption. They had done their part, turning a personal grievance into a cause for communal justice, a voice for all of Montfaucon. When they reached the village, the change was palpable. The serfs, already informed by Alara and Remy of the mission, greeted them in silence, but in their eyes flickered a restrained, reverent hope. For the first time, Thomas felt the true strength of belonging, the fragile thread of solidarity mended by courage. He knew the final confrontation was near. When Lord Arnaud returned from his hunt, he would not be met by a mere serf, but by the authority of the Church, armed with proof, parchment, and moral weight. That night, Thomas surrendered to rest. The rough touch of his straw bed felt familiar again, but no longer oppressive. Outside, the cricket's steady song lulled him, not as a warning, but as a lullaby. Peace settled over him at last, and the image that carried him into sleep was that of the goose quill, the humble object that had entered the halls of power and returned bearing the promise of freedom. Bishop Anselm's decision to intervene turned Thomas's anxiety into a calm, deliberate resolve. He and Jacques were instructed to return to Montfaucon at once, carrying with them the quiet assurance of ecclesiastical support, but cloaked in discretion. The bishop's emissary, a trusted cleric skilled in both canon and civil law, would soon depart for Lord Arnaud's estate, armed with the copied documents and the moral authority to mediate the dispute. The familiar scent of parchment and incense in the episcopal chamber, once merely the fragrance of sanctity, had taken on new meaning. It now carried the promise of justice, a sign that their struggle had risen from the fields to the higher sphere of church and politics. As Thomas descended the palace steps, the cold stone beneath his feet seemed to ground his thoughts. He remembered his grandmother's story, how she sewed and wove endlessly to pay false debts, and realized that hope, once a faint whisper, had grown into a silent hymn. The confrontation with Lord Arnaud was inevitable, but it would no longer be a battle of strength alone. This would be a confrontation of laws, of moral authority against tyranny. The tolling of the cathedral bell at noon echoed like a rhythm of liberation, a counterpoint to the oppressive chimes of Montfaucon's feudal church. From one of the bishop's scribes, Thomas had learned of the Truce of God, Troga Dei, a movement by the church to restrict periods of feudal warfare, declaring days and seasons of enforced peace. That teaching had stayed with him. It showed that, though the bishop's power was not military, it carried the weight to set moral, and at times even legal boundaries for the lords of men. That was the power Thomas now sought to wield, the authority of conscience over cruelty. The journey back to Montfaucon was quicker, but tense. Thomas worried that Lord Arnaud might have already returned from his hunt and somehow learned of their mission. He focused on the forest's familiar scent, damp and grounding, and on the faint touch of the quill he kept safely tucked close to his chest. By nightfall, he and Jacques entered the village under cover of darkness, where Elara and Remy had been keeping anxious watch. When Thomas shared the bishop's plan, the room filled with both relief and fear. The relief came from knowing their truth had been heard by a higher power, the fear from what might follow when that truth reached the Lord's ears. The cold of the night cut through their worn garments, yet a quiet warmth of hope spread among them, a warmth born not of comfort, but of shared belief. With the composure of one awaiting the inevitable, Thomas urged his companions to continue spreading the story of the forged debts, reminding them that justice was no longer a dream, it was on its way. The murmur of the nearby stream filled the silence, its steady flow marking the passage of time. What had begun as one man's burden, a single parchment, had now become a collective cause. The feudal estate had turned into a stage, and at its center stood the struggle for freedom itself. Thomas and Jacques' return to Montfaucon marked the beginning of a tense, contemplative pause. The village, watched closely by Lord Arnaud's overseers, carried on with its daily rhythm, a necessary disguise for the quiet unrest growing beneath the surface. Time itself seemed to stretch thin, and the wait for the bishop's emissary became an exercise in patience and faith. Thomas and his allies focused on observing every movement within the manor and strengthening solidarity among the serfs, turning the silence of waiting into a quiet force of unity. The usual sense of smoke and dry hay still lingered in the air, but now they were laced with an almost tangible anxiety that drifted through the village like mist. Thomas spent long hours in silence by the stream, watching the steady flow of water and feeling the cold touch of damp stones beneath his hands. The ritual slowed his racing thoughts. The soft murmur of the current became a poetic reminder of time's relentless passage and of change that could no longer be stopped. He concentrated on his breathing, slow, deep, deliberate, practicing a kind of peasant meditation that kept fear from taking root. This quiet discipline of the mind was what allowed him to stand firm against the looming threat of retaliation. As days passed, the cultural stillness around him revealed just how deeply the belief in servitude had sunk into the hearts of the elders. Generations of serfs had accepted their bondage as divine design, and the idea that their condition was the result of legal deceit rather than destiny was nothing short of revolutionary. Thomas began to realize that his true struggle was not only against the Lord's tyranny, but against the centuries-old resignation of his own people. He often recalled Jacques' story about his father, who used to stare at the castle for hours and say, "The stones speak of justice, but the Lord's mouth speaks of deceit." That phrase, poetic and bitter, summed up the essence of Thomas's mission. Truth lived in the silenced stories, in the memories of the grandparents who still remembered what freedom felt like. The cold of early morning, biting harder each day, was both a reminder of servitude's cost and an incentive to fight for the warmth of liberty. Bishop Anselm had once spoken to Thomas about the practice of interdicts, an ecclesiastical penalty that suspended all sacraments, from baptism to burial, in a given territory. Extreme though it was, that lesson stayed with him. The Church's power to use faith itself as leverage to wield fear of eternal condemnation was a potent weapon against feudal injustice. The waiting, then, became a psychological war, a tense stillness before the bishop's next move, when faith would rise against fraud. The feudal silence grew nearly deafening, broken only by the faint clanging of Jacques' hammer in the forge, a steady rhythm of resistance, the heartbeat of their quiet defiance. Thomas used Brother Eustache's quill, his private symbol of focus and strength, to draw on the packed earth, the marks representing banalities and tiles, showing a few trusted serfs how the Lord's accounting had bound them in invisible chains. The feel of the damp soil beneath his fingers, the smell of clay, made the injustice tangible and real. The quiet conclusion of his reflection came with the sight of chimney smoke curling upward into the pale sky, a gentle image of endurance, a reminder that even under oppression, a higher power still watched. Thomas felt composed, steady, and ready. He knew that stillness itself was the final preparation for what was coming. The bishop's emissary would soon arrive, and with him the confrontation that would decide the fate of Montfaucon. The quiet of the village during that contemplative pause was a social mask, but beneath it, careful observation revealed small tremors of unrest. Thomas noticed that the serfs spoke more often in whispers, and though the rhythm of labor continued, it carried a new tension, a reflection of collective anxiety. He continued meeting with small, trusted groups, reinforcing the story of legal injustice with a simple cultural truth, that in the feudal world, law often meant the Lord's will, while true justice came from higher authority, like the church. Even the scent of burnt bread, a common aroma in Montfaucon, now seemed symbolic, a scent of waste, a reminder of how much food was surrendered to pay forged debts. He remembered the story of an old serf who, when asked what freedom was, had replied, "It's being able to smell your own food without smelling the tax on it." That poetic image, freedom defined through the most human of senses, was the purest way to make them understand what was at stake. The contemplative stillness became a classroom of sorts, a time of quiet education. Through reflection and metaphor, awareness deepened, and the silence of waiting transformed into a period of awakening. The feel of the soil beneath their feet, as they walked through the fields, was the tactile memory of land that had once been theirs. Bishop Anselm had also taught Thomas a vital lesson about an ancient rite, the jus acili, the Church's law of sanctuary. Within churches and monasteries, fugitives could find protection from secular punishment and noble oppression. Though the bishop's mission was diplomatic, that knowledge was a quiet reassurance to Thomas, that should Lord Arnaud retaliate, there existed a higher refuge, a sacred place where God's law outweighed feudal tyranny. That thought lent him a subtle serenity, a fragile but enduring sense of safety. The rhythm of the manor persisted, corvée labor carried out day after day, a motion that contrasted with the stillness of their waiting. Yet that apparent inaction was, in truth, preparation, an inward gathering of strength. Thomas felt the autumn chill settle into his skin, the cold breath of the coming winter, and he understood that freedom was not only a moral right, it was survival itself. Without it, their harvests, already meager, would be claimed in the name of debts that had never existed. The sounds of hammers, saws, and carts had become to him a chorus of silent resistance, a music of endurance. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, Thomas paused. The fading light bathed the distant castle, turning its cold stone into something almost luminous. He knew the beauty was deceptive, but it reminded him of a deeper truth. Beneath the ugliness of injustice, the world still held a quiet, redemptive beauty worth defending. The quill he carried felt heavier now, not as a burden, but as a symbol, the proof that truth once written could cut deeper than any blade. Then came the sound that broke the long vigil, the distant echo of hooves along the main road to the estate. The emissary was coming. Serenity filled Thomas like a prayer, and he rose, ready for the next act. The arrival of Bishop Anselm's emissary, Father Valère, shifted the entire perspective of Montfaucon. Night itself seemed to change shape. What had once been a stage of quiet endurance became the setting for a new kind of power. Clerical authority, once distant and abstract, now stood in the heart of the feudal world. Father Valère, a middle-aged man with the rigid posture of one accustomed to both prayer and law, arrived on a thin, disciplined horse. The rhythmic strike of hooves on the damp earth carried a strange tension of relief. He brought with him the faint scent of silk and sealed parchment, the smell of the higher church and its machinery of judgment. His lack of fear stood in stark contrast to the wary glances of the serfs watching from the shadows. Thomas and Jacques met Father Valère at the inn, which, for the first time, felt like more than a place of rest. It had become a war room. The rough texture of the wooden table beneath Thomas's palms as he spread out his grandfather's parchment felt like touching history itself, now given voice. Father Valère, his eyes cold and precise, studied the documents again. His view was purely canonical. He explained to Thomas that even if Lord Arnaud had used secular legal forms such as amphituse, hereditary lease, the manipulation of debts and refusal to permit redemption of freedom constituted the sin of usury, a moral injustice that gave the bishop full jurisdiction to act. In the eyes of the Church, this was no longer a legal dispute, it was a matter of the Lord's soul. To illustrate, Father Valère told them a brief but powerful parallel story. In a neighboring fief, a bishop had threatened a noble with interdict, a suspension of all sacraments within his lands, until he freed the serfs enslaved by false mill debts. The warning had worked. That precedent, quietly told, hung in the air like a prophecy. The calm precision of Valère's voice carried the weight of divine law. Against the violence of a sword, he was setting the gravity of sin. For Thomas, this encounter awakened something new, a sense of relief, and for the first time, the certainty that he was not alone. The smell of the dark red wine Father Valère drank filled the room like a restrained celebration. The plan was set. At dawn, they would confront Lord Arnaud in his own hall, with the documents and the human stories of Montfaucon laid bare as evidence of moral corruption. Thomas now saw his home with the vision of a strategist. The castle was no longer merely a fortress. It was the stage of recorded sin, the archive of deceit, and the serfs, once fragmented and fearful, had become a silent, united body, an army of truth. His serenity was no longer that of submission, but of readiness. The calm of a warrior who knows the battle ahead will be fought not with weapons, but with law, faith, and truth. Father Valère instructed him to gather a few of the most affected families, those whose names were written in the fraudulent records, to serve as living witnesses. The evidence would not only speak through parchment, but through voices, faces, and memory. The next dawn would not bring just confrontation. It would bring revelation. Father Valère, seeing the injustice from his own sharper perspective, asked Thomas to choose a group of serfs who represented the full spectrum of Lord Arnaud's frauds, those ruined by mill debts, those stripped of land through forged amphituse contracts, and those who had lost property after being forced into unpaid military service. The goal was clear: to present not a single grievance, but a pattern of systemic oppression. Thomas could smell the coarse wool of the priest's tunic, carrying the clean, reassuring scent of discipline and authority. The cleric's calm presence, shaped by years of facing noble arrogance, stood as the perfect counterweight to Lord Arnaud's looming brutality. That night, priest and peasant worked side by side, weaving the fragments of suffering into a coherent narrative. Each human story became a piece of a legal puzzle. The tale Thomas used most often was his grandfather's, a man whose ancestral freedom had been traded for bondage through a contract that looked legitimate but was built on deceit. The dry texture of the parchment beneath Thomas's fingers, the faint crackle of its aged fibers, and the steady rhythm of his own voice filled the room with quiet power. Father Valère listened in silence, nodding slowly, visibly impressed by the strength and clarity of the evidence. The priest shared with Thomas a telling detail about medieval custom, the sacred weight of the noble oath. A lord could be compelled to swear solemnly before a bishop, and if it was proven that he had broken that oath, especially through fraud against his own people, he risked excommunication, the most feared punishment of the age. To be cast out of the Christian community meant spiritual death and the nullification of his feudal bonds. The meaning was unmistakable. The coming confrontation would not be one of swords, but of honor and salvation. At dawn, the cold was biting, the kind that crept into bone and breath. Thin smoke rose from the cottages, and the faint sounds of morning stirred the village awake to a rhythm of expectancy. Thomas, joined by Jacques, Remy, Ilara, and a dozen others, walked toward the castle. Their faces were a mosaic of anxiety and hope, their movements still heavy but newly firm. For the first time, their posture reflected purpose rather than submission. The slow transformation of fear into quiet dignity was visible in every step. Thomas held the quill lightly in his hand, the fragile, faithful object that had become the center of his calm and the symbol of his cause. The serenity that enveloped him now was not resignation, but certainty, the conviction that truth finally had a voice strong enough to be heard. As the castle loomed ahead, he no longer saw an impenetrable fortress, but an edifice stained by fraud and moral decay. In that moment, Montfaucon itself seemed to shift, the power of faith and justice rising like light over the stone walls, promising that hope, at last, had climbed to the top of the hierarchy of human feeling. The entry into Lord Arnault's castle, led by the composed Father Valère, struck Thomas and the other serfs as an awakening of all senses. The cold morning air mixed with the heavy scent of roasted meat and wine drifting from the great hall, a stark contrast to the humble smells of smoke and soil in Montfaucon. The sound of Father Valère's voice, calm yet commanding as he addressed the guards, was something Thomas had never imagined he'd hear in that place. The voice of ecclesiastical law asserting itself over military power. The feel of the cold stone beneath their feet was a physical reminder of the authority they were daring to confront. The tension in the courtyard was tangible, a silence so thick it felt alive. Inside, the great hall radiated a suffocating opulence. Torches hissed and cracked along the walls, casting long, distorted shadows that danced over polished stone. The air was thick with the smell of myrrh and costly spices from distant lands. Lord Arnault sat on a carved wooden chair, his large frame and severe face bathed in firelight. When he first laughed at the mention of the bishop's intervention, the sound was harsh and dismissive, a bark of disbelief that echoed through the hall. Thomas, standing near the hearth, felt the heat of the flames on his face and glanced down at the dark corners of the floor, where the light didn't reach. It was a fitting image, the shadowed truth hidden within the walls of feudal power. Father Valère, in a display of calm precision, began to speak. He presented Thomas's parchment and the copied pages of the manor's register, their fragile surfaces now bearing the full weight of the Church's authority. His voice was measured and firm as he explained the pattern of fraud, the transformation of unpaid dues and tithes into hereditary bondage. According to the Church, this was not simply legal abuse, it was the sin of usury and moral oppression. Each word pressed Lord Arnault further into silence. When the noble took the parchment into his own hands, its dry, brittle texture seemed to burn. For the first time, he felt the weight of written truth, the one weapon he could not manipulate. The hall was alive with small, uneasy sounds, the faint clatter of armor as a guard shifted his stance, the creak of a wooden door, the hushed breaths of the serfs waiting at the threshold. Together, they composed a tense, invisible symphony. Thomas focused on his breathing, grounding himself in the rhythm of the moment. He could smell Jacques' cold sweat beside him, a mix of fear and fragile hope. Every sense was heightened, turning the legal confrontation into something almost sacred, a moral reckoning. Father Valère then invoked a powerful principle of medieval faith, the Pax Dei, or peace of God, a decree meant to shield the defenseless, peasants, clerics, merchants, from feudal violence. He argued that legal fraud and debt slavery were spiritual forms of violence, violations of divine peace itself. To break that peace was to sin against God, and thus to risk excommunication, the ultimate exile. The words struck deep. Lord Arno's face drained of colour. The arrogance in his voice dissolved into hesitant murmurs. Cornered between spiritual ruin and social revolt, Lord Arno yielded. He offered a settlement, a reluctant act of self-preservation disguised as mercy. The story of Thomas and of all Montfaucon was reaching its turning point. The noble agreed to grant freedom to Thomas and his companions and to restore part of their ancestral land in exchange for their silence and the bishop's restraint. For Thomas, the scent of victory was not sweet, but solemn, the cool, dry smell of parchment as Lord Arno began to write the new agreement. It was the smell of freshly written freedom, fragile yet undeniable, inked by the same hand that once enslaved them. The great hall, once filled with Lord Arno's arrogance, was now steeped in tense silence, broken only by the faint scratch of his scribe's quill as it began to draft the Charter of Freedom. Thomas's senses sharpened. He could smell the sharp tang of iron gall ink in the air, the scent of law being rewritten. The familiar feel of his grandfather's feather, still clutched in his hand, contrasted with the heavy, ornate quill wielded by the Lord's scribe, a quiet metaphor for simple truth triumphing over elaborate deceit. Father Valère, calm and unwavering, watched each word form, ensuring that the agreement was both legally binding and morally sound. Lord Arno, humiliated by the threat of excommunication and the undeniable proof of his fraud, tried to haggle over the terms. The faint tapping of his fingers on the oak table betrayed impatience and defeat. Thomas, serene now that fear had no hold on him, spoke firmly. The liberation must not be limited to those present, but to every family whose bondage had stemmed from falsified debts and forged obligations. He invoked the story of the Dubois family, stripped of their land over a grain debt, to give the demand a human face. Father Valère intervened with a final moral strike. He reminded Lord Arno of a sacred medieval tradition, the Jubilee, or Year of Mercy, when debts were forgiven and captives released. He suggested that an act of clemency, even one compelled by the Church, might cleanse the Lord's conscience and spare his fief from open revolt. The heat of the nearby hearth filled the room, its glow seeming to burn away the lingering shadow of deceit. When the scribe finally finished, the parchment bore a steady, deliberate hand. It declared freedom for roughly 30 families of Montfaucon, those proven to have been bound by fraudulent debts, and restored a portion of their ancestral land. They would henceforth be villeins, free peasants paying rent instead of servitude. Under Father Valère's watchful gaze, Lord Arno swore an oath never again to use the law to impose bondage by debt. His voice, low and stripped of pride, was the sound of justice finally spoken aloud. As Thomas left the castle, the parchment of the agreement pressed against his palms, smelling of sealing wax and fresh ink, the fragrance of liberty itself. He exchanged a look of quiet triumph with Jacques, Elara, and the others, their faces trembling with restrained emotion. What they carried was not just a document, but proof that unity and written truth could defeat centuries of silent oppression. By the time they reached the village, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the ground. Their footsteps were lighter now, free of fear. In the square, Thomas lifted the parchment high before the stunned, hopeful eyes of Montfaucon. In that moment, the veil of tradition that had hidden feudal exploitation was torn away, and what remained at last was justice, warm and real as the light that bathed them. The victory at Montfaucon was not an outburst of noise, but a slow transformation in the air, a gradual shift in the village's light and emotional temperature. When Thomas and his companions returned carrying the sealed agreement, the air that once smelled of resignation now held a faint trace of possibility. The parchment, folded and guarded like a sacred treasure, gave a tangible sensation of newfound freedom, contrasting with the roughness of Thomas's calloused hands. The confrontation was over, but the true struggle, the quiet, enduring work of consolidating liberty, had just begun. The challenge now lay in changing the mindset of the freed serfs. Though the document had granted them the status of villains, free tenants of the land, and partial ownership of their ancestral plots, centuries of oppression could not be erased overnight. Using Eustache's quill as a symbol of knowledge, Thomas began teaching through gentle repetition. Working the recovered soil was no longer an obligation to a lord, but an investment in their own freedom. The steady, patient rhythm of his voice became the pulse of a new kind of education. The scent of the earth, freshly tilled by those now free, carried a new note: ownership, future, and dignity, so unlike the neutral smell of the Lord's reserved fields. The small human story Thomas now told was that of a beginning, how the pen, not the sword, had altered their fate, and how unity had been their greatest weapon. The slow pace of his storytelling was deliberate. Freedom to endure had to be absorbed without reckless joy or fragile disbelief. Autumn's fading light mirrored this fragile equilibrium. Lord Arnaud, though defeated, still held power, and moral humiliation could turn such a man into a subtler enemy. Thomas and Jacques established a communal system of watchkeeping and written records, imitating the castle's bureaucracy, to ensure that no new debts or forged taxes could arise. The daily act of holding a quill and tracing ink onto paper became Thomas's quiet ritual, marking his new role as the guardian of Montfaucon's written memory. It became clear to all that feudal bondage had never been natural. It was a construct of ledgers and law, a system of manipulation disguised as duty. The village's emotional climate hovered between restrained joy and vigilant caution, the foundation of their emerging society. Before leaving, Father Valère had instructed Thomas to keep correspondence with the bishop and send copies of every new record, ensuring that the church's oversight remained a moral balance against the Lord's power. The echo of the priest's voice in Thomas's memory reminded him that justice was not an act, but a discipline. They worked with renewed energy, their rhythm now the rhythm of hope. The cold that descended on Montfaucon was no longer the cold of bondage, but the honest chill of the season, something to be met with unity and shared labor. Freedom, Thomas understood, was not a gift, but a daily achievement, a slow, steady variation in life's rhythm that, with time, would harden into a lasting tradition. The freed families, now working their own plots as villains, moved to a rhythm that was finally their own. The sound of hoes striking the soil no longer echoed servitude, but investment, a labor done for themselves. Thomas, who now spent most of his days with parchment and quill in hand, organized the community, ensuring that Lord Arnaud respected the new limits on taxes and the abolition of fraudulent labor dues. The scent of olive oil and burning wood during their evening gatherings filled the air, a warm fragrance of budding self-governance. Thomas's quiet method of teaching relied on gentle repetition. Freedom, he would say, lives as much in the pen and the paper as it does in the land. He taught the younger serfs the few letters he knew and the importance of recording every transaction with the manor, turning them into guardians of Montfaucon's new written memory. The human story he used to explain this was the contrast between his grandfather's parchment, the proof of theft, and the bishop's parchment, the proof of redemption. Both were made of ink and animal skin, yet each carried a power entirely opposite to the other. The wind that passed through the village carried a new emotional temperature. It no longer whispered of invisible whips and servitude, but of vigilance and quiet hope. Thomas knew that Lord Arnaud, shamed but not defeated, would look for an opportunity to retaliate. So he and Jacques established night watches, not to fight but to observe, keeping an eye on the Lord's steward and scribe to ensure no new falsifications or unauthorized taxes were imposed. Time itself seemed to slow into gentler variations. The green of summer had faded into the bronze and brown of autumn, a visual metaphor for the feudal transition taking place. As Thomas looked across the village, he could feel that fear, though not gone, had softened, replaced by a calm, collective sense of purpose. When Ilara, the village elder, laid a hand on his arm, the gesture carried gratitude and recognition. Justice, though incomplete, had found its way to them. One of the newly freed serfs, teaching his young son to plough their reclaimed field, said quietly, "This land will give us not only bread, but honor." That image of father and son united in labor over their own soil was the true essence of Montfaucon's victory. It was not triumph born of noise or glory, but serenity, the slow, patient realization that freedom unfolds one steady step at a time. Winter announced itself with a biting cold, and the smell of green wood burning in the hearths became a constant presence in the village. Thomas, now the informal scribe of the community of freed villains, spent his days strengthening the foundations of their new social order. Together with Jacques and Ilara, he prepared for the anniversary of the bishop's intervention, an event meant to anchor the memory of their victory and remind everyone of both the cost of deceit and the power of unity. The sting of cold in the air and the long winter shadows cast across the fields created an atmosphere of solemn reflection. Using Eustache's quill, Thomas carved onto small wooden tablets the names of the freed families and their new rental obligations to Lord Arnaud, ensuring the noble could never claim ignorance or confusion in the records. As he worked, he revisited the past, not as lament, but as lesson. The story of his grandfather's forged contract and the false amphituse became parables of vigilance, reminders that freedom survived only through careful documentation. The wind howled through the chimneys, a sound that had once carried dread but now belonged simply to winter, stripped of oppression. The final historical lesson Thomas shared to nurture this new mindset was about the Charter of Franchise, documents granted by lords or kings during the 12th and 13th centuries to define the rights and duties of townsfolk. He explained that the bishop's agreement was, in essence, their own charter, one born not from generosity, but from truth. One day, he said, they would seek a formal document of their own, a permanent guarantee of their rights, safe from the whims of future masters. The village lived in calm expectation. The accord had brought peace, yet complete freedom. The full recovery of their ancestral lands remained a distant dream. The small human story Thomas now told was that of the oak tree. Its roots grow deep and strong, but its rise is slow and demands patience. Serenity came from knowing that the seed of liberty had been planted. The smell of burning wood, warm and resinous, had become for him the scent of autonomy, a comforting contrast to the cold stone odor of the castle. He and the other leaders met in Ilara's cottage, where the dry straw beneath their feet rustled like a familiar song. They retold the stories to ensure the memory of the fraud would not fade, teaching the young that bondage had been imposed by law, not destiny. The poetic image that lingered in the room was that of a dim candle, casting its light over weary, yet determined faces, a fragile flame that mirrored the quiet hope they kept alive in the heart of Montfaucon. Thomas continued to guide the freed villains, gathering them on long winter nights, where the only warmth came from the hearths and from the quiet strength of their newfound alliance. He reminded them that Lord Arnaud still held the right to collect rents and taxes, and that freedom demanded precision. Every payment, every exchange had to be recorded, leaving no room for the noble to invent new debts under the pretext of a harsh winter. The muffled sound of snow falling outside became the background music of their caution. He asked each family to preserve the small human story of their liberation, to pass it on to their children as a tale of warning and courage. His final lesson drew from a historical truth about the medieval abbeys. Many of them had kept records of land and contracts for centuries, forming an unbroken chain of law that reached further than any single lord's authority. The bishop's intervention, Thomas explained, had reconnected Montfaucon to that ancient memory of justice. This idea became the community's final step toward closure, a calm expectation of lasting security. The scent of smoke, once the smell of mere survival, had turned into the fragrance of autonomy. The sting of cold air on Thomas's skin reminded him that the medieval world was unforgiving, and that freedom was the only shelter against its brutality. He found quiet joy in watching Ilara, now able to sell her herbal remedies without surrendering a portion of her earnings to the Lord, a small but profound sign that justice could take root in everyday life. Their calm expectation of the future was not one of paradise, but of fairness. Thomas understood that oppression was cyclical, and that the next planting season would demand the same unity and the same vigilance over the written word. He placed Eustache's quill and the parchments into a wooden chest, the community's new archive, and ran his fingers over the smooth, cold surface, feeling the weight of what it now guarded. Montfaucon's secret and its promise. The poetic image that closed this chapter was that of candlelight reflecting on snow through the window of Thomas's improvised scriptorium, a faint, persistent glow. It was the quiet symbol of serenity, a reminder that truth had been written, and that justice, for now, had prevailed. Winter had settled fully over Montfaucon, wrapping the village in a quiet peace that felt like a natural closure to the turbulent year of liberation. Thomas sat inside his small cabin, watching the pale light that filtered through the window and reflected off the snow outside, a subtle return to the story's first image of light and darkness. The silence that once carried the weight of oppression now belonged only to the season, a slow, comforting rhythm of endurance. In his hands he held his grandfather's parchment, the document that had begun it all, feeling the texture of the old material, which smelled faintly of history and resilience. The harmony between past and present defined this final reflection. Thomas thought of his grandfather, who had died a serf, and of himself now, a villain, free to work, to choose, to pay rent, but own his time and a share of his ancestral soil. The contrast between generations of resignation and the recent triumph formed the small human story that marked Montfaucon's new era. From somewhere nearby came Ilara's soft voice, humming an old song about endurance, a quiet melody of contentment. Lord Arnaud, humiliated and watched over by the bishop, remained secluded in his castle. The scent of his moral defeat lingered faintly in the air, like the weak smell of cold ashes. The forced accord had revealed the fragility of the feudal system, long disguised behind the mask of tradition. The poetic farewell that lived in Thomas's mind was that of the frozen river, its surface hard and still, Yet beneath it, the current of hope and life continued to flow, ready to thaw with the spring. He knew freedom was not a destination, but a process. The bishop's parchment was a handwritten jubilee, a chance to begin again, but vigilance against fraud and usury would always be necessary. He remembered Father Valaire's story of the quill, that it was mightier than the sword, and that thought formed the final summit of his understanding. The touch of Eustache's quill in his hand symbolized the truth, that once truth is written and remembered, it transcends brute strength and arbitrary power. The candlelight in his cabin cast soft, long shadows across the walls, and the pine-scented warmth of the fire was the warmth of a home finally safe. The peace he felt was the certainty that the feudal order, though not destroyed, had been successfully challenged by unity and by memory. His legacy would not be that of a resigned serf, but of a keeper of law and truth. He looked through the small window at the silent, pure snow and smiled, feeling at last the deep calm of a man who had fulfilled his purpose. The sense of peace that enveloped Montfaucon was not the absence of labor, but the absence of fraud and endless exploitation. Thomas, now the keeper of the village's memory, used his quill and parchment to record daily life, turning the simple act of writing into a ritual of freedom. In his mind, he replayed the transformation of the manor. Once, the cottages had been dark and silent from fear. Now, they glowed with the light of small hearths and the gentle murmur of conversations about next season's harvest on their own land. The smell of burning peat, once just a necessity for warmth, had become the scent of autonomy. The poetic farewell he felt was that of the returning sun, melting the snow to reveal the soil beneath, a land that belonged to them now, not merely to the Lord. His reflection was clear. The greatest injustice of feudalism had never been labor itself, but the legal deceit that sustained it, a veil of tradition that concealed theft, now torn apart. The final climax was not found in confrontation, but in the quiet persistence of truth. He thought of Jacques, who had returned to his forge with renewed purpose, and of Elara, teaching the children to draw the letters of the law, the next guardians of freedom. The chill of snow against the window, a faint and fleeting touch, marked the last movement of the season. Thomas understood that peace meant embracing the rhythm of life without the shadow of oppression. He rose, feeling the warmth of the hearth on his back, and stored away the parchment and the quill, the two objects that had changed Montfaucon's fate. The feel of the packed earth beneath his feet reminded him of the soil that had once bound him and now set him free. The last story was that of an old freed serf who planted a tree on his reclaimed land, saying, "A tree grows slowly, but its shade is for the grandchildren." That poetic image of a future rooted in earth and hope was the gentle closing of his tale. Injustice had been unmasked, and truth, like water beneath the ice, would always find its way. The wind in the chimney whispered its rhythmic song, the sound of peace. Until tomorrow, traveler, I'll be here, waiting to journey with you through these forgotten ages. You already know where to find me, right here, between history and dream. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and rest well, traveler.